Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world where seduction isn't about swiping or witty texts but about crafting the perfect fragrance in a land where every breeze is laced with cinnamon, rose, and ambition. You lie beneath a soft Persian twilight where sandstone walls glow warm from the day's sun and cypress trees cast long, thoughtful shadows. The garden around you isn't just a place for leisure, it's a silent symphony of smells. And you, fortunate sleeper, are drifting through history's most aromatic love story. The air carries hints of cedar wood and a whisper of something citrusy, like someone crushed a lime zest between their fingers an hour ago, and the scent's still holding on for dear life. You lean in toward a flowering bush, half asleep, half intrigued, only to realize it's not the petals, but the oils rubbed onto its branches the deliberate work of someone trying to impress someone else, because in ancient Persia, nothing was ever just aesthetic, everything smelled like a message. And here's the kicker, your nose might get you killed or married, depending on who's reading it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your sandals crunch against pebbles dusted with saffron pollen, and something about this feels oddly intentional. You realize the path is perfumed, not metaphorically, literally. The stones are rubbed with aromatic resin, so lovers strolling through the garden leave a trail of olfactory breadcrumbs. The practice, part perfume, part private diary, Persian. Elite had garden architects who doubled as matchmakers. They didn't just plant roses, they arranged scent flows, calculated how certain fragrances would mix in the night air, and knew which hour jasmine was strongest. It wasn't just for fun, it was strategy. By the time you reached the center fountain carved marble, lotus-shaped and perfumed with rosewater, the right person would be waiting, having followed a scent they couldn't ignore. That might sound like overkill until you remember there's no electricity, no nightlife, no meme page to like their posts. Scent was presence. To make yourself known, you had to smell like something unforgettable. And in Persian culture, where love letters were often composed in poetry and delivered by hand, a person's scent could be the prelude, the content, and the postscript all in one. The body was the envelope, and the envelope was scented. Historians still argue whether these gardens were actual matchmaker spaces or just spiritual sanctuaries, but accounts from travelers, especially Greek and later Islamic writers, repeatedly mention the air so sweet one might fall in love with it. That wasn't nature, that was engineering. A blend of plant placement, herbal misting, and in some cases, slaves trained specifically to apply scent to surfaces using long-handled brushes dipped in oils. Imagine being a teenage crush and having a full-time perfumer assigned to set your ambience. It's giving candlelit dinner, but aggressively extra. Now, here's the real twist. You know those classic Orientalist paintings with veiled women lounging near fountains? What they don't show you is that those veils were likely perfumed cloths. A woman's veil might carry notes of civet or crushed violet petals. It wasn't just to cover the face, it was to control the reveal. You get close, the scent shifts, the message unfolds. This wasn't deodorant, it was dialogue. A mainstream fact that's often buried under the spice and romance is that perfume making in ancient Persia was an empirical science. Long before Europe's alchemists got moody with their alembics and gold obsessions, Persian perfumers were meticulously distilling oils using apparatuses that would eventually inspire modern chemistry. Avicenna, yes, the Avicenna who wrote a whole book on medicine, developed steam distillation techniques using rose petals. And he wasn't trying to smell pretty, he was chasing purity and potency. Because if your scent faded too quickly, so did your credibility. But here's your quirky detail for the night. Some aristocrats believed that if you wore a new perfume without fasting first, your soul wouldn't recognize it, like wearing someone else's memories. So before major banquets or flirtations, lovers would abstain from food not for health, but so their inner being could align with the perfume's intention. You smell yourself before you eat, spiritually speaking. Try using that as an excuse next time you skip brunch. You pause at a stone bench, the edge is worn from centuries of similar pauses. Someone once proposed here, probably with a small clay pot of perfume in hand, the cork sealed with wax and a tiny pressed flower on top. Maybe they rehearsed a line like, "My love, your presence makes the roses bloom twice," which sounds cheesy now but was, back then, a 10 out of 10. You think of the sheer effort to find the right mix of oils, to ensure it lingered but didn't overwhelm, to make sure the scent clung to your skin like a secret rather than screaming for attention. There's something delicate about this pursuit of affection. No one was shouting across taverns. They were whispering through Roma. Persian poets were obsessed with this. Hafiz, Sadi, Rumi, they all wrote about how a beloved scent was more real than the beloved themselves. Lovers could go missing. Scents could haunt you for decades. And so, the act of perfuming became a kind of immortality, especially when paired with silk letters soaked in sandalwood. A message might be passed from lover to lover, folded carefully, and each time opened, the scent reawakened the memory. That's Perfume as Time Machine, and that's just section 1. We haven't even hit the political propaganda yet. Your footsteps take you past the lotus-shaped fountain, deeper into the garden's underbelly, where the night air cools and clings to your skin like silk dipped in mint tea. The smell shifts again, this time sharper, citrusy, almost flirtatious. And it hits you. You are not just wandering through plants. You are walking through someone's curated seduction. In ancient Persia, scent wasn't ornamental, it was a system of signals, designed to draw, repel, impress, or intimidate. And nowhere was this more powerful than in the art of courtship, where the nose always got the first impression. You think of how today we rely on photos, bios, maybe a clever pun if we're lucky. But for the Persians, your scent was your opening line. You didn't just wear perfume, you became it. The body was the diffuser, the soul the recipe, and every person who mattered was mixing something personal in tiny ceramic bottles. With names like Breath of the Cypress or Rain on Pomegranate Leaves, you lean into a shadowed alcove where vines creep like gossip over old stone. There's a lingering fragrance of rosewater and frankincense here, the staples of any serious romantic gesture. Persian lovers believed certain smells stirred certain emotions. Rose opened the heart, saffron sparked desire, myrrh grounded the body. And this wasn't just superstition, it was backed by observation. Centuries of blending and noticing how people responded. A nobleman might request a perfume for calming a jealous wife, while a woman might ask her apothecary for something to keep a lover honest. That's the thing, perfumes weren't sold by ingredients, they were sold by desired outcome. Today's equivalents would be named Don't Text Him or Make Him Regret Everything. And speaking of noblemen, you pass by a low table, where 3 small pots are displayed, each sealed with wax and a scrap of silk. These were love letters, though not in the traditional sense. In Persia, a perfume could arrive as a proposal, wrapped carefully. It might be presented without a single written word. If the recipient opened it and wore it, that was a yes. If it remained sealed, gathering dust on a dresser, the answer was silence, and silence, too, smelled like something, usually dried lemon peel and ash. You catch that scent now, faint but present, and wonder how many lovers walked away with broken hearts and still carried the smell of rejection in their sleeves. Now, the science, smell, unlike the other senses, travels directly to the brain's limbic system, the part that controls emotion and memory. This is true now, and it was true back then. Persians didn't have MRIs or neuroscience textbooks, but they understood something deep. To make someone remember you, you had to make them smell you. That's why the court's favorite perfumes were passed down like royal bloodlines. Recipes were guarded like treasure maps, and sometimes, literally, carved into tomb walls or etched into poetry so the lover's essence could outlast their breath. Historians still argue whether some of these ancient perfumes were actually aphrodisiacs or just clever marketing, but there's no debate about their value. Some perfumes were worth more than horses, than land, than dowries. That bottle you just passed, it would have cost someone half a year's income, and they used it on their neck for one afternoon picnic. Your quirky detail for this section is hidden inside a bronze cylinder, half buried under ivy. It's a portable scent kit, something an upper-class man might carry strapped to his belt. Inside, tiny compartments, one for paste perfume, another for powdered musk, and one wait for it for emergency breath powder made from crushed cardamom and dried mint. Because even back then, halitosis was a mood killer. These kits weren't just for freshness, they were portable identities. A man might wear one scent to the court, another to his lover's home, and yet another to funerals. Some even switched scents hourly, claiming it kept the mind agile and the heart unpredictable, whether or not that worked is up for debate, but hey, at least no one could accuse them of being boring. Now here's where it gets a little theatrical. The Persians didn't just smell good, they made their scent arrival part of the spectacle. Imagine this, you're waiting in a garden, heart pounding, when suddenly a gust of wind brings a wave of jasmine and sandalwood. You turn, but see no one. Then, a few seconds later, the nobleman steps through the archway. The scent was his herald. It arrived first, announcing him like a trumpet. This wasn't just vanity, it was planned. Servants were trained to spritz garments just enough that the scent preceded the body, but didn't drown the encounter. Think of it like the cinematic equivalent of walking into a room with your theme music playing. But smellier, historians still debate whether scent-based courtship crossed class lines. Some argue it remained a luxury of the elite, while others point to poetic verses and folk songs that suggest even peasants participated in scent rituals, albeit with humbler ingredients. Instead of ambergris or imported cinnamon, they used local herbs basil, thyme, sometimes crushed dates mixed with clay and worn behind the ears. It might not have won over a duchess, but it certainly made the village festivals more interesting. You continue past a stone archway into what looked like an abandoned bathhouse. Its marble tiles cracked, but still glistening. The air here is heavier, muskier. This was likely a place where lovers met in secret under the guise of shared bathing, though everyone knew what that really meant. Perfume played a role here too. Oils were massaged into the skin, not just for scent, but to make the skin itself memorable, soft, shimmering, and fragrant. Some claim that certain perfumes, when applied to wet skin, changed their notes depending on emotion. Whether that's science or poetry, no one's sure, but lovers swore it worked. And in matters of attraction, belief is half the seduction. There's one last stop tonight before your dream deepens. A shadowy alcove with carvings in old Persian script, a love poem. You trace your fingers across the stone, the translation. Roughly, I knew her not by voice, nor sight, but scent the night she passed. I followed petals, and found her waiting. You smile. It's cheesy, but kinda perfect, because as the breeze shifts and a new wave of spice and flower rolls over your senses, you realize something. This isn't just a bedtime story. This is a love letter wrapped in sandalwood and sealed with time. You move with the breeze now, your body slower, your mind tuned to every molecule of aroma drifting through this labyrinth of memory and myth. The path narrows as you step between crumbling walls, once painted with images of winged bulls and burning suns, but now just faint shadows and clinging jasmine. Your fingers brush against a chipped tablet, and beneath a thin film of dust you recognize something ancient and astonishing. A recipe etched in cuneiform, faded yet defiant, not for soup, not for medicine, for perfume. This isn't a potion of survival, it's a potion of desire. You've arrived in Babylon, once Persian territory, now a crossroads where scent became diplomacy, seduction, and sometimes sabotage. Here, in this spice crucible of civilization, perfume wasn't just a personal indulgence. It was bottled diplomacy, love in a vial, war in a drop. You're about to see how something as innocent as flower water could tip the balance of power between empires. The markets of Babylon weren't silent, and they certainly weren't clean. Imagine it, the sweat of traders, the stink of livestock, the heat bouncing off clay roads. It should have been unbearable, but then someone walks past, trailing an aroma of crushed mint and date syrup, and suddenly everything shifts. That's not magic, that's branding. The nobles knew they had to rise above the common stench, so they paid enormous sums for oils from India, incense from Arabia, and resins from even further west. These scents weren't local. They were imported in by their very foreignness. They screamed status. You weren't just someone. You were someone who smelled like another continent. And in Babylon, the ability to smell like a world beyond was seduction in its purest form. You pause before a small alcove that once belonged to an apothecary. The shelves are gone, but you can still see the outlines of bottles and one remaining clay jar, sealed with a waxy crust, dares you to open it. You don't, of course not because you're polite, but because there's a very real chance that what's inside hasn't aged gracefully. Ancient perfumes didn't have preservatives like today. Still, the idea makes you smile. Somewhere in history, a man or woman carefully measured ingredients for this very jar, not for themselves, but for someone else, to make a statement, to seduce, to remember. A fragrance that cost them sleep, silver, and maybe pride. That's the thing about these recipes, they weren't always romantic. Sometimes they were tactical. Historians still argue whether the infamous scents of peace that Persian envoys carried into enemy courts were truly neutral. Some suggest they were laced with herbs that dulled aggression, that made hosts drowsy, even euphoric. It's speculation, sure, But the ancients believed deeply in the power of scent to alter mood and manipulate perception. Imagine the general agreeing to a truce while bathed in lavender oil, not because he wanted peace, but because his brain mistook the smell of a lover's neck for diplomacy. Can't prove it, but can't disprove it either. Let's not forget the women of Babylon. Oh, they knew the game. Female scribes left behind notes, tiny instructions in the margins of clay tablets on how to make specific perfumes that could evoke longing at dusk or remembrance in grief. That's your quirky fact tonight. Some of the earliest recorded perfumers were women. They worked in temple complexes, often tied to love goddesses like Ishtar. And their formulas weren't just romantic, they were divine. To recreate the scent of a goddess wasn't blasphemy. It was aspiration, and in a culture where the divine mingled freely with the sensual, wearing a perfume made in the temple was a way to say, I am more than flesh. I am myth-made skin. You catch a new aroma now deep, earthy, like wet soil kissed by clove. That would be labdanum, harvested from the resin of shrubs, and a staple in Babylonian perfume. It gave depth, complexity. It turned simple oils into symphonies, and it lingered on skin, on clothes, in rooms sometimes for days. That lingering mattered. Lovers needed their scent to remain long after their footsteps faded. Some even perfumed their walls. You heard that right. Special oils were rubbed on bedposts, headboards, even stone benches, so the space itself carried the memory of intimacy, not bodies, but essence. You move on, slipping past what was once the inner gate to a palace courtyard. Here, royalty would host scent banquets. Yes, that's a thing. Meals where every course was infused with perfume, not just the food, but the plates, the napkins, the air. Frankincense burned under the table. Rosewater was sprinkled over guests between courses. At perfumed doves, yes, actual birds rubbed. In scented oil were released to fly overhead, their flapping wings creating aromatic breezes. Over the top, absolutely, but imagine the impact. You smell cinnamon and orange blossom, then taste lamb cooked in rose and saffron. Your senses blur. You don't know where the meal ends and the lover begins. That was the point. This wasn't just excess, it was strategy. Rulers knew that to control emotion was to control memory. And scent, more than sight or sound, buried itself deep in the folds of the mind. A visiting dignitary might forget the exact terms of a trade deal, but he'd remember the smell of that night and the woman who smiled at him across the table. That memory could be leverage or a trap. You stop before a low marble basin, dry now, but once filled with perfume oil for washing hands before prayer or intimacy. This simple act, cleansing oneself with scented water, wasn't just hygiene. It was ritual. It signaled a shift in the self, from public to private, from war to love. You bend. Imagine your hands submerged in warm, fragrant water, and for a moment, you feel both cleaner and more vulnerable than you expected. That's the power of these ancient habits. They weren't about looking good. They were about transforming. From person to persona, from stranger to seducer. You remember something now, almost like deja vu. But it's just a callback. That scented veil from the garden. It's here again, but this time, soaked in a different blend. Myrrh and hyacinth. The smell of funerals and new beginnings. Someone must have worn it to mourn a lost lover, or maybe to seduce a new one. Either way, the veil still smells like intent. As the wind shifts once more and the ruins of Babylon blur into the dreamy contours of your imagination, you take one last deep breath. This place, this time, wasn't just about empires or trade routes or poetry carved in clay. It was about how the act of bottling a flower became a language more powerful than speech, because long before we learned to say I love you, we were already whispering it through sandalwood and rose. You keep walking, slowly now, the scent trail loosening like old ribbon in the wind, and as you round a crumbling pillar, something delicate brushes your face, a hanging scrap of parchment, impossibly preserved, dancing from a branch that shouldn't hold anything but dust. You glance closer. The script is elegant, almost flirtatious in its curves, and your eyes follow the strokes with a lazy sort of awe. This is no royal decree or bureaucratic nonsense. This is a letter, a scented one, and just like that, you've landed in the middle of Persia's lesser-known seduction tactic, perfume correspondence. Imagine it, a folded message dipped in saffron water, air-dry beneath a sunlit window. Its every curve steeped in fragrance, so that the moment it's open, it breathes life into the words. This wasn't just about perfume. This was the art of amplifying language. Words didn't stand alone. They were escorted by aroma, and that aroma told its own story. You, half asleep now, almost smile. Because what you're reading is more than a love letter. It's a performance. The ancient Persians were linguistic romantics. Their letters weren't just read, they were experienced. Lovers infused their parchment with scent to evoke the mood they wanted. Their message to carry: rose oil for affection, basil if things were rocky, violet if they wanted forgiveness, and if a letter arrived unscented, that said something too. It screamed formality, distance, a wall. It was the olfactory equivalent of a cold shoulder, and they knew it. That's the brilliant part. Scented ink wasn't just an accident of beauty. It was manipulation layered like strategy. One sniff, and you already knew whether to be hopeful or heartbroken before even reading the words. You watch a young scribe in your mind's eye, elbow deep in rosewater and paste, carefully grinding petals with powdered sandalwood to create an ink that would speak onto levels visible and invisible, and it worked. Letters were known to be passed around for weeks, not because of the poetry, but because they smelled so good people wanted to reread them, just to feel close to the sender again. Some letters weren't even meant to be opened. They were kept, sealed, treasured purely for their scent as symbolic embrace stored in a wooden box. This isn't just speculation. Clay tablets and early Persian texts describe such practices, and historians still argue whether the elaborate process of perfuming parchment was a widespread custom or a niche courtly trend. Either way, the fact that people would go to such lengths tells you something important. For these people, love was a multisensory event. You didn't just fall for someone's words. You fell for the way they smelled on paper. There's a charming French detail buried in one of the archives of the Achaemenid period. Some scribe, clearly overworked and maybe a bit cheeky, notes in the corner of a document that he added twice the usual rose oil to mask the bad poetry. Even bureaucrats had their perfume hacks, and who could blame them? If you had to write rejection letters for a living, wouldn't you want them to at least smell like something worth remembering? The structure of these letters was often poetic, not just in style, but in actual form. Sentences folded to mirror flower petals. Some were arranged in spirals, so the reader had to rotate the parchment to follow the message. A subtle, sensual gesture. You weren't just reading, you were caressing the letter open. There's a certain intimacy to that. The scent rises with each unfurling curve, as if the sender is slowly unveiling themselves, not just metaphorically, but literally in scent. And here's something that might tickle your modern brain. Some letters had scent trails. That's right, you'd open the main letter, but tucked inside was a smaller strip of perfumed parchment meant to be worn on the wrist, under the collar, or inside a sleeve, a kind of olfactory keepsake. Today we have screenshots. They had sandalwood slips. Same idea, different technology. You passed through what must have been a lover's alcove, a private chamber. The walls still lined faintly with traces of script, defaded to read now. But you imagine it. Names, initials, verses, maybe curses. Not all love stories ended well. Some lovers probably overscented their letters, either out of desperation or overconfidence, and ended up smelling like panic. There's a phrase from a late Sasanian text that reads, loosely translated, "He came with too much jasmine into little sense." You chuckle to yourself. Some things never change. Perfumed letters weren't limited to affairs of the heart. Political envoys used them too. Emissaries might send ahead a message bathed in cedar wood, add frankincense to prepare a ruler's mood, soften hostilities, or feign intimacy. It wasn't just charm. It was psychological warfare. Send a message that smells like a memory, and you make the reader vulnerable, confused, nostalgic. Persian politics understood this long before modern. Your emotions are a hallway, and scent holds the master key, and the inks. Not all were made equal. High-ranking lovers used expensive infusions. Saffron ink was the peak. It glowed golden and smelled like desire dipped in sunlight. Only the wealthiest or most lovesick used it. The ink bled into the parchment like a soft echo, and under candlelight, it shimmered faintly. There's a story of a prince who once sent 70 letters, each on a different floral scent, to woo a single woman. She never replied, but legend says the storage room they were kept in became so fragrant, it was repurposed into a bathhouse. Talk about making an impression. Here's your open debate nugget of the night. Scholars still question whether these letters were read in private or allowed in salons, like performance pieces. Some argue that the scent made them the personal meant only for the recipient. Others suggest that in elite circles, sharing a letter's fragrance became part of the gossip cycle. Imagine your friend handing you a love letter and saying, "Smell. This is intense. You lean in, inhale deeply, and suddenly, you're in someone else's romance. That kind of sensory second-hand affection is uniquely Persian, and the calligraphy fluid, precise. Looping like scent trails themselves was an art form all its own. Scribes sometimes trained for years to perfect the emotional cadence of letters. A good scribe didn't just write what you said, they translated your feelings into shape and smell. Their job was to make sure your words danced and your scent lingered. In a way, they were ghostwriters of desire. The scent fades a bit now as you move away from that long-lost love letter, the parchment disintegrating gently into the wind behind you, as if the romance was never meant to last forever, just long enough to be remembered. You feel its memory cling to your sleeves, and maybe a bit to your thoughts. There's something powerful in knowing that people, thousands of years ago, went through all this effort just to say I'm thinking of you, in a way that couldn't be ignored or forgotten. The ink may fade, the paper may crumble, but scent outlives even heartbreak. You move into the shadow of a towering colonnade, the cool stone whispering of forgotten feasts and nervous hands brushing robes scented with precious oils. This part of the city, you can tell, once belonged to the ones who didn't have to shout, the ones whose status came not from how they dressed or walked, but from how they smelled. And now, you're standing right where they stood, noblemen, priests, queens, all oozing importance with every scented breath they exhaled. You can almost feel it in the air, a rich, almost overwhelming aroma of musk, ambergris, and something spiced, like cinnamon stirred into warm wine. This isn't the scent of nature. This is the smell of civilization straining under the weight of its own luxury. You're about to learn that to be someone in ancient Persia meant smelling like something nobody else could afford. Welcome to the world of royal sweat and civilized stink. By now, you've probably caught on that the Persians weren't casual about perfume, but in elite circles, scent wasn't just romantic, it was proof that you had power, proof that you weren't breaking your back in the fields, because to smell good in a hot, dusty empire required serious infrastructure. You needed access to clean water, imported oils, time for bathing, servants to apply the fragrances, and an understanding of how scent worked in layers. This wasn't a splash and go situation. Nobles were layered in scent like modern influencers in makeup tutorials. Start with a base, maybe frankincense oil, then a middle note, sandalwood or civet. Top it off with rose, jasmine, or bitter orange. And yes, that final spritz was applied not by yourself, but by someone else. Because touching your own perfume, that was for peasants. The garments mattered too. Persian robes were often made of cotton or silk, materials that absorbed and held scent beautifully. Some nobles even lined their sleeves with tiny pockets of herbs and dried flowers, so that every time they gestured, a little cloud of fragrance would waft into the air. You can picture it now, a man flicking his wrist during debate and unintentionally making the whole room smell like a lemon grove. Coincidence? Absolutely not. This was theater, and it worked. Smell had a halo effect. If you smelled like heaven, people were more likely to believe you belonged there. Here's your historical tidbit for tonight's episode of Elite Smell Culture 101. In the court of Darius the Great, perfumers had the same status as royal scribes. They were trusted, valued, paid very well. Because a noble scent wasn't just personal, it reflected on the entire court. If a visiting ambassador caught a whiff of something foul, it could be interpreted as negligence, or worse, disrespect. That's right, bad breath could start a war. But here's your quirky twist. Not everyone was a fan of the perfumed elite. Some satirists of the time, poets, who were, let's say, less than enchanted with the upper class, mocked this obsession with smell. One anonymous scroll includes a poem that reads, "He smells like 20 camels and still thinks he's divine." There was a line, apparently, and some people crossed it. Too much musk. And you stopped being attractive and started being a hazard. And oh, the musk. Let's talk about it. This wasn't your gentle, powdery synthetic musk from a modern perfume counter. This was animal musk, specifically the glandular excretion of the male musk deer, aged and processed until it turned into something people were willing to wear to a dinner party. The raw stuff, it reeked like sweaty fur and regret, but once aged and diluted properly, it became something complex, erotic, and strangely addictive. The elite loved it because it was hard to get. Musk had to be imported, processed, and aged for months, even years. That exclusivity made it a status symbol. If you smelled a musk, people didn't just know you had money, they knew you had patience, connections, power. Ambergris was another favorite. In case you managed to forget, ambergris is whale vomit. Technically, It's a waxy substance produced in the intestines of sperm whales, which washes ashore like some kind of foul treasure. The Persians considered it incredibly precious. Why? Because when exposed to air and aged properly, it develops a sweet, earthy aroma that fixes and amplifies other scents. It's like the auto-tune of perfume makes everything else smell better. And yes, it was worn not just by women but by men, scholars, generals, even spiritual leaders. Ambergris wasn't just perfume, it was perfume's best friend. And here's the open debate. Historians still argue whether the intense layering of perfumes by Persian elites was purely aesthetic or had deeper symbolic meaning. Did they believe certain combinations had mystical properties? Some texts suggest yes. There were recipes said to ignite inner vision or repel the evil eye. Others were meant to align the body with the stars, turning a person into a walking constellation. Sounds wild, but considering how much they respected astrology, it's not entirely implausible. In a culture where fate and fragrance mingled freely, smelling right might just mean living right. You imagine standing in the middle of a royal gathering, eyes half-lidded from too many spiced dates and warm wine, your senses dulled except for smell. Everywhere you turn, a different noble radiates their personal blend. One smells like honey and cedar, another like leather and clove. It's overwhelming, a symphony of status, a nose fight for attention, and at the center, probably the king himself, cloaked in a fragrance that no one else in the empire is allowed to wear. That's right, some rulers had signature perfumes, and it was illegal for anyone else to use them. Imagine trademarking a smell. The ultimate flex dot as you turn to leave. You catch a whiff of something sour and oddly familiar sweat, not the clean kind, the panic kind. It's coming from a figure hurrying past, robes disheveled, clearly not meant to be here. You realize, with a sleepy grin, that not everyone in this fragrant world belonged to it. Some snuck in. Some faked their scents with cheaper oils, hoping to pass as noble. And if they got caught, that leads us to another strange little corner of history, olfactory imposters. Some merchants and middle-class romantics tried to mimic elite perfumes by boiling cheap herbs in wine or vinegar and bottling the result in stolen noble jars. Occasionally, they got away with it, but if someone got to bold, say, wearing the king's signature blend to a festival, they could be outed by scent alone and punished publicly. Some were shamed not with prison, but with scent, forced to wear intentionally offensive perfumes like onion paste or donkey fat for days on end. It was a reminder. Smell could elevate, but it could also humiliate. You step out of the colonnade into the open air again, your head a little lighter from all the imagined musk and ambition, and you realize that this whole obsession with fragrance wasn't just about beauty or desire. It was about presence. In a world without photos, videos, or recordings, your scent was your legacy, your declaration, a part of you that could linger long after your body had left the room. And for the noble classes of Persia, that lingering meant everything. You step into the hazy light of early morning, the kind of light that turns dust into gold and makes every shadow stretch like it has somewhere important to be. The wind is quiet now, holding its breath as you move forward, and there's something different about the air. It's heavier, denser, filled with a kind of anticipation. You're no longer in the palaces or private gardens. This is trade route territory now, caravan territory. Welcome to the underbelly of Persian perfume, the wild, sweaty, and strangely romantic world of the long-distance scent trade. The clink of bronze scales, the creak of camel harnesses, and the soft rustle of silk sacks all blend with the unmistakable smell of oud, the heavy, woody perfume oil that costs more than gold by weight and is basically the Beyonce of ancient perfumery. And here, deep in the bizarre smoke and desert wind, you begin to realize that woman in Persia wasn't just an art. It was a global operation. You follow a trader now, his robe stained at the armpits, but his belt pouch heavy, with crushed agarwood chips from India. He smells like sweat and commerce, like stories that traveled thousands of miles in tiny ceramic jars. He walks past stalls selling everything from dried roses to opium paste to something unlabeled, but definitely suspicious, and you watch him. Pause to sniff each offering with the precision of a sommelier. One sniff, one nod, one silver coin. Deals made through the nose, not the mouth. Here, scent is currency, and the rarer the note, the louder it sings. Oud, for example, wasn't just a fragrance, it was a statement. Obtained from infected aquilaria trees, oud is technically a defense mechanism. The tree gets wounded, produces resin and humans lose their minds over it. It's intense, musky, almost aggressively mysterious, the kind of smell that doesn't ask permission before taking over a room. The Persian elite couldn't get enough of it. But here's the twist: most of them never saw the source. The oil arrived in ornate flasks, sometimes mixed with other woods or diluted with base oils, then rebottled in the empire's cities like it had been born there. Historians still argue whether the Persians preferred raw oud or the blended adder versions. Some texts insist on purity, others praise the symphony of notes. But there's no question that oud was seen as masculine, powerful, and ironically wild. The irony being that it required the slow, methodical rot of a tree wound to exist at all. This is your quirky moment of the night. During one caravan journey, a noble woman fell in love with a camel driver not because of his eyes or his poetry, but because he had rubbed out oil into the rope he used to tie her luggage. She claimed the scent clung to her memory like fire to parchment. They exchanged letters for years, always scented with the same blend. She eventually married someone else, of course duty and all that, but it said her perfume tray kept a tiny glass vial labeled rope oil, romanced by accident, sealed by scent. You pass a group of traders sitting around a brazier, smoking something that smells like myrrh and dried plum skins. The smoke curls upward, slow and deliberate, and you realize this isn't a rest stop. This is performance. These men, rugged and weather-worn, are preparing their scent profile before entering the city, because even camel drivers knew the power of olfactory first impressions. They didn't just sell goods, they sold presence. A trader who smelled like the forest might be selling out. One who smelled a rose was likely pushing his fattened silks. One who smelled like goat, probably just a goat herder, and yet even he might carry a satchel of crushed herbs to mask the livestock. Nobody wanted to be remembered for smelling like their job. The dessert played its part, too. You learn quickly that scent moves differently in dry heat. It rises faster, sharpens quicker, fades sooner. Traders adapted their recipes accordingly. Heavier oils, thicker bases. Scents built to survive 1,000 miles on camelback and still smells seductive at the palace gate. There's a beauty in that kind of resilience, a romance born of grit. And yes, the women knew this too. Caravans or rest stops for traders were also pickup spots. You imagine a woman passing through, cloaked, aloof, but with a scent that made three men forget their names. One whiff of jasmine spiked with clove, and suddenly someone's writing a poem they don't understand. Smuggling was inevitable. Rarer perfumes, those using civet or rare roots, were taxed heavily. Enterprising romantics learned how to hide vials in sandals, bake oils into bread, or even disguise perfume as medicine. One text from a market inspector in Susa complains about rosewater pills being passed off as stomach cures when they were clearly love tokens. That's how serious it got. Romance literally masquerading as pharmaceuticals. Here's something historians debate to this day. Did traders intentionally make their goods more seductive by scenting them? Some argue it was purely functional to keep rot at bay, to mask other smells. Others suggest that it was entirely deliberate. Perfumed, silks, scented scrolls, spices that smelled better than they tasted. Maybe they understood something marketers still use. People trust their noses. Make it smell like love, and they'll buy anything. There's a stretch of dessert now, open and humming with silence. And in the distance you see a lone figure kneeling beside a small fire. They're distilling something. You can smell it before. You arrive sharp, green, with hints of smoke, probably myrtle or eucalyptus. This is the traveling perfumer. Part merchant, part alchemist, part seduction consultant. They specialize in making custom scents for people on the move. You imagine a soldier asking for something to impress a woman before heading off to war, or a widow seeking a perfume that reminds her of her husband. The perfumer listens, nods, grinds, boils, bottles. This wasn't just economy, it was therapy. And the best part, many of these perfumers kept recipe scrolls, some of which survive today in fragments. Ingredients like ash of red fig, oil of pressed almond, and tears of date pulp sound like spells, and maybe they were. Each blend meant to summon a different emotion: love, regret, hope, sleep. That's the thing about Persian perfumery. It wasn't just for the body, it was for the soul. And in a world where letters took weeks and news traveled slower than wind, perfume was a message that didn't need translation. As you watch the perfumer bottle his latest creation, a thin oil glowing amber in the firelight hue, wonder how many lives were changed by a single scent. How many enemies forgiven, how many lovers drawn near, all by something that vanished into air. Maybe that's what makes it powerful, the way it disappears, but never quite leaves, the way it lingers on your memory like the echo of a voice you can't remember, but know you loved. The sand crunches beneath your steps now, softer than stone, but still tinged with the scent of centuries. You've left behind the smoky caravan trails and the rough-handed traders, and in their place rises something more ceremonial. You feel it in the air, a kind of ritual calm, punctuated by the soft whiff of myrrh, the distant sweetness of spikenard. This is where love, scent, and statecraft collapse into one grand production. You're entering the world of Persian marriage rituals where courtship wasn't a string of flirtations, but a theater of scent, silk, and sanctified oil. And like everything in this empire, marriage smelled like a contract, a beautiful, fragrant contract, but a contract nonetheless. You glide beneath a stone arch flanked with faded carvings, a woman pouring oil over another's head, a man holding a small vial near his heart. There are no words on the wall, just the language of gesture and aroma, because here, the sacred and the romantic were inseparable, and nothing marked a union quite like the smell of myrrh soaked into skin. Persian marriages, especially among the elite, were orchestrated like coronations. The rituals stretched for days, sometimes weeks. Every step had a fragrance, from the cleansing bath the bride took in rosewater and milk, to the anointing of the groom's wrists. With a mixture of musk and almond oil, you weren't just preparing bodies, you were preparing symbols. The couple became vessels of scent, aromatic declarations of purity, wealth, readiness, and yes, even submission. A bride's hair would be combed with saffron oil, her garments lined with crushed cloves, and if she was from a family of note, her veil would carry a scent blended by the same perfumer who served the local temple. You breathe it now and swear you catch the ghost of one such blend, sweet, earthy, slightly bitter like love laced with duty. There's a part of the ceremony often left out of modern retellings, the perfume exchange. Before vows were spoken, gifts of scent were traded between families. Sometimes these were small crystal flasks filled with concentrated adders. Other times, the perfumes were woven into the fabrics gifted to the bride. A cloak that smelled of rose and cedar, a sash, perfumed with cinnamon. These weren't just tokens, they were signs of intent, promises that the marriage was sanctioned, sacred, and sealed. To receive a scentless gift was a grave insult. It suggested your presence was tolerated, not celebrated. That's your mainstream fact for the night. In Zoroastrian tradition, marriage rituals incorporated scent not just for the joy of it, but as a spiritual component. Fragrance was believed to attract divine favor and repel darkness. The god Ahura Mazda was associated with light and goodness, and part of his presence was believed to manifest through purity and beautiful smell. And here's a fringe detail you won't hear in many textbooks. There were love potions passed off as perfumes, not full-on magical brews, but blends designed to evoke desire or reduce hesitation. One such mix combined black pepper oil, dried damask rose, and a few drops of civet. It was applied just behind the ear or dabbed onto a scarf meant to be accidentally dropped during the betrothal feast. Whether it worked is still debated. Some say it quickened the heart, others say it just made people sneeze. But either way, it was part of the performance. You imagine the bride to be sitting still while her attendants apply the blend, her face calm, but her pulse racing, because even in arranged marriages, there was still space for chemistry, both the emotional kind and the scented kind. Now, let's talk about the wedding bed. Not in that way. Don't worry, we're staying PG-13, but you should know that the sheets were perfumed too. Clove, cardamom, sometimes sandalwood rubbed into the threads. Some were even soaked in diluted rosewater and sun-dried for days so they'd retain the scent long after the ceremony. And yes, historians argue whether this was meant for the couple or the guests who peeked in the next morning to confirm the marriage had been consummated. Either way, scent was present at every step, a kind of invisible witness to the union. One of the most curious roles in these rituals was that of the scent bearer, usually a younger sibling or cousin, tasked with carrying the family perfume chest during the marriage procession. This wasn't some trivial job. The chest contained oils selected for specific phases of the wedding, each with its own symbolic meaning. Juniper oil for cleansing the path, amber for protection, violet to soften judgment. These scents would be dispensed at key moments before the bride entered the hall, when the groom lifted her veil, when the couple shared their first toast. You can almost hear the clicks of the glass stoppers, the hush of the crowd as the air changed character from tense to intimate. That was perfume doing its work, modulating mood, setting tone. anchoring memory. And what about the guests? Oh, they weren't just there to eat and dance. They were scent participants too. Upon arrival, they were offered handkerchiefs soaked in a light floral water. Some were even misted with a celebratory fragrance as they entered a kind of olfactory welcome mat. These scents were carefully chosen to complement, not compete, with the couple's own aromas, because the newlyweds were supposed to smell like the center of the universe, and anything that distracted from that was considered deeply impolite. You step into what must have been the bridal chamber, and even though the flowers have turned to dust and the linens are long gone, you still get a trace of something sweet, something determined. It smells like saffron and anticipation. The funny part, not everyone liked the tradition. A few writers from the Parthian period poked fun at the over-scented nature of Persian weddings. One even joked that no man could find his bride beneath all that jasmine, and another snarkily observed that some wives smelled better than they behaved. Clearly, not every marriage born of perfume was a happy one, but still, the rituals persisted, because whether or not the couple stayed in love, their wedding was meant to be remembered. And scent, more than speech, held memory like a flame cupped in the hand. As you leave the chamber, a breeze stirs and you catch the ghost of frankincense curling along the corridor, soft and persistent. It's a reminder that for the Persians, love wasn't just a feeling, it was a performance of scent, played out in oils and herbs and carefully timed whiffs. And whether the couple lived happily ever after or merely tolerated each other until death, the scent of that first day lingered, echoing across time like a vow you can still smell, even after all the words have faded. You turn from the faded bridal chamber and walk slowly through the corridor, the morning light catching in patches of old mosaic tiles. Their blues and greens faded like the memory of a song. There's a hush in the air now, not the romantic kind, not the regal kind, but something older, more spiritual. You can smell it before you understand it. Sandalwood, myrtle, dried fig smoke, and an unmistakable sharpness of something burnt, but sweet. You've crossed into sacred ground. This is no longer the palace of perfumes or the wedding hall of saffron veils. This is a temple, and this is where you meet Zoroaster, not in the flesh, of course, but in the scent. Religion in ancient Persia wasn't something you wore on your sleeve. You wore it on your skin. Zoroastrianism, the dominant spiritual framework of the empire, was deeply sensory. Fire was sacred. Cleanliness was next to godliness, and scent was how you whispered to the divine. You glance down and realize the ground beneath you isn't just stone, it's packed ash and crushed herbs. The faithful didn't just pray. They prepared the air around their prayers. They cleansed their bodies, purified their clothes, and then burned resins and herbs to clear the path between the physical and the metaphysical. You're standing on a perfume altar, in effect, where smoke was the stairway between mortal intention and divine approval. Every Zoroastrian ritual began with fire, not just any fire, consecrated flame, tended carefully, fed only the purest of woods and incense. Sandalwood was a favorite. It didn't smoke too heavily, and its scent was believed to calm the spirit and sharpen the conscience. When devotees gathered, they often carried scent with them, not perfume, not vanity, but ritual smell. Men and women alike dabbed sacred oils onto their foreheads, the crooks of their elbows, behind the ears. You inhale, and it feels like the temple is still breathing them in return. This wasn't just about smelling nice. It was about moral hygiene. The body, the soul, the air around you all had to be clean to welcome Ahura Mazda, the creator god. And the idea that you could smell righteous, very real. Priests were known to sniff out impurity, literally. If someone showed up reeking of drink or carnal mischief, or, worse, the cloying scent of rival cults, they could be turned away. It wasn't a perfect system, but it added a whole new layer of meaning to come as you are. You pass a crumbled niche in the wall where a priest might have once stored his incense blends. No labels, of course, just memory and repetition. Historians believe these priests, known as mobeds, memorized dozens of formulas. One for morning offerings, one for funerals, one for seasonal ceremonies. Your quirky tidbit for tonight: one of the most prized blends used in temple rituals combined blue lotus, dry lime peel, and deer musk. Why? Because it was said to mimic the scent of a clear sky after rain. That's how poetic these recipes were, not floral or earthy, but full narratives in scent form. Now, let's talk about dating. Because yes, even here, in the sacred heart of fire and fragrance, there was room for romance if you knew how to behave. Zoroastrian courtship, especially among the devout, came with an entire ethics of scent. You couldn't just slather yourself in perfume and hoped for divine approval. Scent was supposed to reflect inner virtue, modesty, honesty, wisdom. So young, men often wore very mild oils: lavender, almond, crushed iris, so their character wouldn't be overshadowed by their presentation. Likewise, women might apply rose or violet water behind the ears, but nothing too loud. If your perfume entered the room before you did, people whispered. If it lingered after you left, people gossiped. And if you happened to smell like the incense from the temple, well, that was the sweet spot, literally, because that said you were disciplined, spiritually attuned, and also somehow sensual. Who doesn't want their crush to think they're a walking hymn? Here's your open debate for this stretch of our night walk. Historians still argue whether these scent practices were enforced from the top down by religious leaders, or if they grew organically from the culture's values. Was it doctrine, or just taste? Did the priests really issue olfactory guidance? Or did people intuit it from stories, songs, and parental scoldings? Either way, the result was the same: a population that treated scent as a reflection of moral alignment. To smell good meant to be good, or at least to know what good was supposed to smell like. You crouched near a crack sensor, imagining the hands that once filled it with resin and firewood. Maybe they hesitated, maybe they whispered a prayer, maybe they were just cold. But that fire, that smoke, was more than heat. It was an offering. And some believed that the smoke didn't just rise, it remembered. That's your fringe idea. For tonight, some Zoroastrians believe scent had memory, that the incense burned in ritual left behind a spiritual imprint, a kind of olfactory ghost. So if you returned to the temple later and caught a familiar scent, you weren't imagining things. The god had remembered you. Now imagine a young couple meeting during a festival. They don't touch, they barely speak, but both have attended the fire rituals. Both carry faint traces of the same sacred incense in their clothes, their hair, their breath. When they pass each other, they recognize it. Not just the smell, but what it signifies. They are both, in some ineffable way, clean, and that shared scent, it becomes a bond, the beginning of something quiet, slow, and deeply respectful, a courtship not of glances, but of shared atmosphere. There's a poetic justice to this kind of romance, isn't there? In a world obsessed with speed and spectacle, this slow dance of scent feels revolutionary. It says, I will know you by your values, not your volume. I will remember you by your aroma, not your appearance. I will love you not with haste, but with breath. As you rise from the cold floor of the ruined temple, the light has shifted again, softer, more forgiving. You walk out beneath the open sky, the lingering scent of sandalwood still in your lungs, and for a moment, the whole world feels cleansed. Not sanitized, not scrubbed, but spiritually aired out. You carry a whiff of that ancient reverence now, tucked somewhere in your collar, and maybe, just maybe, you smell a little better for it. The temple fades behind you like the last puff of incense from a bronze burner, and the path beneath your feet shifts once more, this time to packed earth dusted with fine ash and old pebbles. You're heading into the laboratory now, not the temple's spiritual scent nor the court's ceremonial fragrance, but the precise, clinky, deliberate world of distillation, experimentation, and obsession. This is where love becomes liquid through fire and patience. You've reached the perfume workshop, a long, low room with clay ovens built into the walls, glass bottles resting like sleepy eyes on carved shelves, and hanging baskets of dried botanicals that sway ever so slightly when the wind brushes past. It's warm here, not dessert warm, but oil warm, resin warm. The kind of warmth that carries stories you can't quite put into words, but your nose understands immediately. Imagine this, to apprentices, sleeves rolled, eyes red from smoke, slowly, heating a mixture of crushed rose petals and rainwater over a clay oven. They wait some more. The first drips of attar, the concentrated essence start to collect in a narrow glass vial balanced by nothing more than divine hope and decent balance. This isn't a quick process. It takes days to distill a perfume worth writing a love letter about. The process requires knowledge, intuition, and a nose that can distinguish between too much saffron and not enough time. These weren't hobbyists. These were scientists in tunics. They took notes. They argued. They tested how perfume aged on skin versus fabric versus air. And all of this, every tedious little drop, was in service of love, legacy, and a chance to make someone's heart race with a single inhale. Persians didn't invent distillation, but they absolutely perfected it. The name you'll hear most often is Avicenna or Ibn Sina. the philosopher, physician, poet, polymath who wrote encyclopedias and occasionally dabbled in making the world smell better. He's credited with refining steam distillation, especially for rose oil, but even before him, distillation was practiced by Persian alchemists trying to isolate the breath of the flower, the soul of the plant. They believed that every natural thing had a spirit, and to distill it was to bottle its essence without killing it. You weren't just extracting smell. You were preserving meaning. Your mainstream historical fact for tonight is this: Persian perfumers developed some of the earliest aromatic apparatuses, those glass and metal setups that look like science fair projects from the underworld. Fire at the base, copper still in the center, cooling coil made from bent reeds or metal spirals. This system allowed them to separate top, middle, and base notes before they even had words for them. They might not have said this is a citrusy opening with a woody dry down, but they understood that perfumes moved through phases and they designed their oils to tell a story in layers. Now for your quirky, edge of the scroll detail. Some perfume recipes were designed to change based on the wearer's mood. One blend combined coriander seed oil, bitter almond, and a rare orchid that only bloomed at night. It was believed that if you wore it while nervous, the smell would become sweeter. If you were confident, it would turn sharper. Whether this was chemistry or pure imagination is still up for debate, but the belief was strong enough that nobles requested the blend for political meetings, hoping to project whatever emotion best served the room. Imagine modern job interviews. If your deodorant betrayed your real feelings, the perfume lab also doubled as a test site for relationships. A suitor might commission a custom fragrance as a gift, tailored to their beloved's astrological sign, season of birth, and personal scent preference. That meant interviews, observations, and often a sneaky lock of hair to test for compatibility. These perfumers were part scientists, part matchmakers, part spies, and they kept records. Scrolls full of results. Client X responded well to clove, but disliked patchouli. Client Y's pulse quickened upon exposure to warm resins. These notes weren't medical, they were emotional data points. That's how seriously scent was taken. Love wasn't just a gamble, it was an experiment. There's something else worth noting here. In these labs, men and women worked side by side. Some of the most skilled perfumers were women, either trained within temple systems or through family workshops. One name that occasionally surfaces in obscure trade documents is Layla Ray, a woman known for her signature blend of smoke-cured rose and star anise. Her perfumes were said to be impossible to forget, even if you tried. Clients wrote poems about her. Some tried to marry her. She declined them all, stating, "My oils speak louder than husbands." You've got to admire that energy. Let's pivot slightly to what historians still argue about. Were these perfumers credited as artisans, or were they seen as servants? Some records list them as craftsmen, paid generously with recognition and housing. Others lump them with household staff, barely mentioned unless a scandal occurred, like the time a royal perfumer was caught selling dilute, the amber oil, and had to flee to a rival court. That's the tension in the historical record. Perfume was everywhere and essential, but the people behind it often remained in the scented shadows. You step past a table filled with tools, bone spatulas, clay bowls, a cracked copper funnel, and your foot knocks something that rolls lazily across the floor, a corked glass vial, still half full. You pick it up, cautiously twist the top, and inhale. The smell is strange, warm, woody, spicy, something between nutmeg and a campfire after rain. You feel it before you name it. Memory. It smells like someone waiting. And suddenly you realize why these perfumers worked so hard. It wasn't just for love or money. It was because their creations could outlast them. A perfume could live longer than its maker, its wearer, even the memory of who gave it and why. That's legacy. That's alchemy. You walk on, passing shelf after shelf of carefully labeled jars, some filled with dried petals, others with thick resins or mysterious black powders. One label simply says, "For longing," another, "Too softened refusal." You imagine those being used in secret, a hopeful lover anointing a letter, a nervous widow preparing for her first dance in years, a king standing in front of a mirror, wondering if his scent is enough to erase last night's argument. These oils weren't just decoration. They were tools for vulnerability. As the warmth of the room presses gently against your skin, you pause at the final table, where a single candle still burns low in its holder. The wax is perfumed. Of course it is. Everything in this room has been coaxed into meaning. You close your eyes, lean in, and inhale one last time, and what you get is not a flower or spice or a wood, what you get is curiosity, the scent of someone asking, what if this worked? And you think, maybe that's the most romantic scent of all. You leave the perfumer's lab slowly, like someone emerging from a dream soaked in cedar and questions, and as you step outside, the light has changed again. It's dusk now. That soft Persian gold hour where shadows stretch longer than memory, and even the breeze feels like it's remembering someone. The scent in the air is no longer lab-born or smoke-summoned. It's floral, bold, deliberate. You're walking into a recreation of paradise, a Persian garden, perfectly symmetrical, flowing with water channels and thick with the smell of jasmine, orange blossom, and something rare, perhaps immortal or tuberose. But this isn't just a beautiful garden, it's something far stranger. This garden was designed to smell like heaven, literally. You've reached the part of history where empires tried to bottle paradise, and people wooed each other by recreating the afterlife. Ancient Persian texts, particularly during the Achaemenid and Sassanid periods, describe heaven as a garden, not metaphorically a literal garden, a place with perfect trees, fragrant breezes, and the sound of water flowing without effort. And since heaven smelled like the gods, the Persians decided that if you wanted to impress someone romantically or politically, you needed to make them feel like they'd stepped into the divine. That's how perfumed gardens were born. These weren't random assortments of flowers. Every plant was chosen for its fragrance, blooming schedule, oil yield, and symbolic value. A lover walking through the garden wouldn't just see beauty, they'd smell intention. And if you could make someone associate you with the smell of heaven, well, then you didn't need pickup lines. You pause under a vine-heavy trellis where two types of jasmine twine together. One blooms at dusk, the other at dawn. Their scents overlap briefly during twilight, and just before sunrise, a trick of chemistry, and time meant to mirror the balance of night and day, male and female, yin and yang. That's your historical fact for this stroll. Persian horticulturists were essentially perfumers with roots. They calculated bloom times, sun exposure, even humidity patterns to ensure the garden's scent profile shifted subtly every few hours. You could walk the same path morning and night and feel like you were into different stories. That made the garden an ideal place for slow romance walks where words were few. But the air did all the talking, and talk it did, because this was no passive environment. The garden was engineered to speak. Rose bushes were planted along winding paths, so their scent lingered longer as you walked slowly. Mint patches were placed near water channels, so their coolness was amplified by the breeze. Citrus trees lined the entrances, giving visitors a sharp, clean welcome that said, "You're here." This is where it begins. Even the fountains weren't exempt. Some had rosewater or saffron water poured into them at set times, turning the entire airflow into an invisible love letter. And yes, before you ask, lovers often met here, quietly, respectfully, but undeniably. There are scattered records, mostly poetic or court gossip, that suggest matches were made over the smell of night-blooming flowers and the accidental brushing of scented sleeves. Now, your quirky detail. Some elite families hired professional garden noses, not gardeners. Those were separate. These people's sole job was to walk the garden at various hours and report back on the scent balance. Too much lily near the west gate. Swap in narcissus. Rose overtaking orange blossom. By the fountain. Time to prune. These garden noses kept the olfactory symphony in check, ensuring that guests and especially romantic targets had the perfect aroma journey. Imagine being so rich that you have a guy whose entire job is sniffing your backyard. There's also evidence that specific garden layouts were designed to appeal to certain temperaments, based on the ancient medical theory of humor's black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. Gardeners created scent trails to soothe or stimulate. Melancholic, walk the lavender and marjoram path. Overheated, let the pomegranate blossoms and make cool your passions. It's not exactly modern psychology, but it's a fascinating intersection of medicine, mood, and perfume. Historians still debate whether this was truly effective or just clever marketing by the empire, as horticulture guilds. But the belief endured. Scent could heal, scent could charm, and scent could guide. The heavenly inspiration didn't stop at the garden's boundaries. Lovers tried to capture it. Small boxes called paradise cages were carried by women of status. Inside, tiny branches from the garden, often orange blossom, jasmine, or myrtle soaked in a bit of oil and sealed in silver or bronze. The scent would release slowly as the metal warmed against the skin, creating a wearable echo of the garden itself. If a man complimented the aroma, He was also complimenting the woman's connection to divine beauty. Smooth, right? There's a tale, likely embellished by generations of poets, about a woman named Tali from Ecbatana who carried a vial of heaven's dew, a blend of lily, myrrh, and fake flowers she claimed was given to her by a temple gardener. She wore it only once a year, during the spring equinox festival. The smell was so unique that suitors followed her through the market, trying to guess its ingredients. One finally got it right mostly. He left out the fake flower. She declined his proposal, saying, "If you don't know the sweetness in the finish, you don't know me. It's petty, it's perfect, it's peak Persian romance. You follow a curved path now, lined with low-flowering shrubs that puff tiny bursts of scent when touched. Another garden trick. Plants like sage and thyme release oils under stress, so placing them along walking paths means every footstep activates a new whiff. This was intentional. The garden wasn't static. It responded to presence. It bloomed differently when watched. It whispered more when walked. Slowly, lovers were expected to move gently, to let the flowers do the flirting. Here's your open debate. Scholars can't quite agree on whether these perfumed gardens were open to all classes or reserved strictly for elites. Some records suggest that temple and public gardens were accessible during festivals, while others insist that the most fragrant corners were private gated, guarded, reserved for the politically and romantically privileged. Either way, the association between scent and sanctity ran deep. To walk in a garden was to touch the edge of paradise, to smell it. That was grace. The sun dips lower, and the shadows turn lavender. You sit at a stone bench beside a pomegranate tree, its blossoms still holding the heat of the day, and you realize something profound in its simplicity. These people didn't build their heaven with gold or fire or fear. They built it with flowers, and they believed that if you could make someone feel divine on earth even for just one breath, you had given them something eternal. The sun is almost bowed out now, leaving behind a sky that looks like someone spilled ink and then tried to wipe it clean with rosewater. You rise from the garden bench slowly, as if leaving the lover's side, and the path leads you out of the paradise you've just breathed in straight into the dustier, louder, and infinitely more chaotic world of the dessert marketplace. The scent here is less poetry and more punctuation. Cardamom slams into cumin, then slides under a wave of burnt sugar and goat hair. You're no longer in a perfume performance for the elite. You're in the real Persia now, where camels fart, vendors argue, and seduction smells like sweat and desperation. But don't be fooled by the chaos, because hidden among the spice stalls and wool carts, there's an entire olfactory language at work. And yes, people still fall in love here. They just do it with a little more smoke and a lot more flair. You turn a corner into a narrow lane and catch your first scent trap. A wave of smoke drifting from a shop where an old man is burning agarwood chips over coals. Not to sell, just to lure, because in places like this, where mouths are full of sand and social cues get lost in translation, scent is a flare gun, a declaration, and sometimes a pickup line. The stall isn't labeled, but it doesn't have to be. You know what he's selling before you even see the shelves: perfume bricks, oils, scented powders, and most importantly, scented smoke. This is the art of dakun, a practice that predates hashtags by a few millennia, where people burn fragrant wood, resin, or dried herbs to scent the air, their clothes, their breath, and sometimes their intentions. You watch a woman walk past, her robe momentarily catching the smoke. A second later, a young man across the alley visibly sniffs the air and follows, smooth, maybe, subtle, not even a little, effective, every now and then. The Persian market was a breeding ground for sensory flirtation. Vendors knew that scent could manipulate the mood of passersby. Want to sell figs, burn clove, push in velvet, try rose. Trying to marry off your daughter? Frankincense in the doorway and cinnamon in the stepot. These weren't tricks. They were cultural defaults. You didn't just scent the goods, you scented the space. And love, like any good sale, depended on creating an atmosphere. Your historical tidbit here is a simple but juicy one. Persian merchants often scented their coin purses. Why? Because money that smelled nice was less likely to be accused of being stolen. And in some cases, if a merchant overcharged a customer, but the coin purse smelled amazing, the buyer let it slide. That's right, perfume is economic lubricant. Some even rubbed rose oil on the scales used for weighing goods. It didn't make the math better, but it made the experience feel more pleasant. Historians still debate whether this was manipulation or just good marketing. But one thing's for sure, You'd rather be cheated by someone who smells like roses than someone who smells like camel feet. Now for your quirky French detail. In smaller dessert towns, some innkeepers had what was essentially a smell menu, not food scent. For a small fee, you could request your room to be prepared with a specific fragrance. Newlyweds might choose myrtle and musk. Traveling scholars like basil and sandalwood to help them sleep. One particularly bold option was market mix, a bizarre blend of every scent sold in the bazaar, designed to make the guests feel like they were still part of the hustle, even in bed. Only the truly nostalgic or the truly nose-blind ever chose that one. Let's talk a moment about the camels. Yes, the camels. Because even they weren't immune to the culture of scent. In certain regions, caravan owners rubbed the reins and saddles with oil blends to both condition the leather and mask the natural musk of the animals. And here's where it gets spicy. During seasonal festivals, some even went so far as to perfume the camels themselves. There's an archive complaint from a courtier who claimed he was outshone by a better scented beast. That beast, apparently, had been rubbed with jasmine and cloves, and no, the man never lived it down. Romance in the market was rarely direct. It had to slide under the radar of parents, gossips, and vendors to nosy for their own good. So young lovers developed scent-based codes. A woman might walk past her interest wearing one scent the first day, then return the next day wearing another, signal in a reply. Patchouli might mean wait for me. Orange blossom, I noticed you. If she returned with no scent at all, well, that was a subtle heartbreak. Scent as Morse code for the romantically frustrated. Here's your open scholarly debate for this section. Were these scent signals universally understood or localized? Some suggest that certain scent codes were widely recognized across cities and villages like a shared language. Others argue that it varied wildly by region, class, or even family tradition. One village's I like you might be another's back off. Without standardized perfumes, the possibilities for miscommunication were endless. Imagine someone showing up wearing what they think is flirty cinnamon and accidentally sending a related vibe. Tragic, but entirely possible. Another layer to this whole atmosphere, scent competitions. No, really. During festivals or wedding markets, groups of young people would compete not with dance, not with song, but with perfume. Each participant would present a personal blend, worn on their wrists or shoulders, and walk through the crowd while others rated them, sometimes anonymously, sometimes not. The most praised scent often led to offers not just for marriage, but for trade, apprenticeships, or even political alliances. Scent wasn't a finishing touch, it was your handshake. And don't forget about the entertainers. Storytellers, dancers, even acrobats often scented themselves before a performance, not just for aesthetic reasons, but to help the audience remember them. The goal wasn't to smell good in the generic sense, it was to smell unique. One poet named C.R. always carried a pouch of dried lime and mint in his cloak, and every time he read aloud, he'd discreetly squeeze it near his heart so the scent would release mid-performance. People said his poem smelled like spring even when he spoke of winter. That's the kind of brand building we're still chasing today. The sky's deepening now into its most honest blue. The market's quieting, the smoke thins, and the scent fades with the last rustle of canvas being pulled down over wooden stalls. But something lingers, not just the spices or the perfume oils or the trace of jasmine from the woman in the red shawl. Something more ephemeral. The feeling that in this mess of bartering and barbecuing and barely disguised flirting, someone is still waiting to be noticed. Maybe it's the old man burning agarwood. Maybe it's the girl with the rosehip vial hidden in her sleeve. Maybe it's you, because in this corner of history, everyone was a little scented and a little hopeful. You leave the bazaar as night folds its velvet over the city, and the breeze finally turns cool, not sharp, not biting, but the kind of cool that feels like someone whispering secrets to the back of your neck. You'd expect the air to go neutral, now, scentless, quiet, but no, instead, you get something unexpected: sharp cinnamon with a metallic edge, and a strange sweetness that almost hides the rot underneath. This isn't romance. This isn't commerce. This is danger. Because tonight, you're walking through the darker corridors of ancient Persian perfumery, the alleys where scent wasn't used to seduce or soothe, but to manipulate. You've just met the assassin's cologne, and it doesn't play fair. Perfume, in the ancient world, wasn't just about love letters and marriage rituals. It was also a weapon, subtle, portable, intimate. There are records, some whispered in poems, some scrawled in the side margins of medical scrolls that describe the use of scented poisons. A lover's gift that wasn't a promise, but a trap. A vial of rosewater laced with powdered henbane. A lock of perfumed hair infused with belladonna. These weren't mass weapons. They were precision tools, designed for targets who let their guard down the moment they inhaled. Because that's the real power of scent. It gets in before suspicion does. You turn down a shadowy side street and imagine a nobleman stepping into his private quarters. After a long day of courtly backstabbing, he finds a small bottle on his table marked with a lover's symbol. He smiles, opens it. The scent is familiar ambergris and saffron, her usual blend, but something's different. He can't place it. He breathes in again. His lips go numb. He doesn't wake up. That's your mainstream historical bite. Poisons were sometimes delivered through perfumes. Because perfumes gave plausible access, you could apply them to robes, to pillows, even to skin under the guise of affection. One Greek source even claims that a Persian queen kept a ring filled with toxic perfume to dab behind her ears when diplomacy failed. Now for your quirky twist. There were scent testers and some court servants trained to detect the difference between real perfumes and poisoned ones. They didn't use animals. They used their own skin. Drops were applied behind the knee or inside the wrist. And if nothing tingled or blistered within 30 seconds, the bottle was cleared for use. These testers often died young, of course, but the good ones, those with callous noses and slow metabolisms, became invaluable. Some were even promoted to intelligence roles, tasked with identifying foreign perfumes and tracking down their makers, because if you knew who blended a poison, you could trace it back to the hand that paid for it. Historians still argue whether these stories are more legend than fact. There's limited hard evidence, but plenty of circumstantial patterns, mysterious deaths, sudden illnesses following gift exchanges, descriptions of perfumes that smelled wrong right before a powerful person collapsed. The trick, as always, was plausibility. If your victim died in bed, surrounded by flowers, who would suspect the vial of perfume instead of the food or drink? That's what made perfume such an elegant weapon. It could be slipped into courtship, into luxury, into faith. At once inhaled, it didn't just alter mood, it altered breath, life, permanence. There's an infamous figure, mostly legend, probably a little real, named Persian, a perfumer turned political saboteur, who allegedly created scents designed to unhinge the mind rather than kill. One such blend reportedly caused hallucinations if worn continuously for more than 3 days. Another made the user weep for lost loves that had never existed, romantic, only in the most tragic, opium dream sort of way, and yet, these perfumes weren't banned. They were coveted, because people feared the scent that could kill, but they craved the one that made them feel something beyond reason. Let's talk about scent decoys. Another clever use of fragrance in espionage and intrigue. A noble woman might wear a strong signature scent when appearing in public, something impossible to ignore, like heavy jasmine or raw musk. But in private, she switched to something else entirely. That way, if an assassin targeted her using scent recognition, they'd miss. Literally follow the wrong trail. There are scrolls from the late Sassanid period that mention counter perfume, a technique where one scent was used to mask another deliberately, especially when leaving secret meetings. You might smell like cedar, but underneath was a trace of burnt fig resin, a signal only your contact would recognize. Your fringe fact, some assassins were trained in perfume application, not just for themselves, but to manipulate others. They'd walk through crowded areas, brushing against people, leaving traces of scent that made them easier to track, easier to confuse, or easier to implicate. Smell a little too much like a recently deceased vizier? Congratulations, you're now a suspect. That's how nuanced it got. And yet, among all this danger and deception, scent still managed to seduce. Some of these poison perfumes became fashionable. Once a notorious blend was associated with a high-profile death, knockoffs would appear in the market within weeks, stoned down, of course. People wanted to wear a little bit of danger, to smell like power, even if it once meant demise. A blend that took down a prince was suddenly worn by courtesans and merchants alike. Scent as statement, scent as rebellion. There's also something heartbreakingly poetic about it. Think about it. The same sense that triggers memory, comfort, love also carries the ability to deceive, to destroy, to undo. In a world without fingerprints or video surveillance, scent was one of the few intimate identifiers people carried with them. To manipulate it was to manipulate trust, and lovers, perhaps more than anyone, were the most vulnerable. Imagine receiving a perfumed letter. It scent familiar, tender, reminding you of evenings shared beneath almond trees. You bring it to your face, inhale, and suddenly your throat tightens. Your fingers go cold. The words blur. And just like that, the last scent you ever know is one you once associated with warmth. That's the cruel genius of it. Perfume doesn't shout, it whispers. And when used with ill intent, it whispers betrayal. You walk on now, into quieter streets. The scent of spice and ash replaced by the crispness of dew, and the faint sweetness of crushed leaves underfoot. It's easy to forget as you breathe in this softer air that not all perfume stories ended with love poems and wedding beds. Some ended with silence, with the last gasp scented like amber and regret. But even those stories belong here, because history isn't made only of the beautiful. It's made of everything we dared to breathe in, whether we survived it or not. You follow the trail out of the city's narrow alleys and into a broader avenue, where the moonlight pours like silver oil across sandstone in silence. The wind has shifted again. This time, it carries no poison, no burning out, no sacred smoke, just the quiet, almost mocking freshness of crushed mint and dry dust. You've arrived at the part of the empire where perfume becomes less about flirtation and more about finance. Smell, in this stretch of Persian life, becomes a tax bracket. Because tonight, we're talking about class and how in ancient Persia, what you smelled like could tell everyone exactly how much you were worth. Welcome to the section where the stinking rich weren't just metaphorical. Let's get something out of the way early. If you were poor in Persia, you didn't smell like roses. You smelled like work, like dust, like sweat cooked into cotton, robes, and maybe, if you were lucky, the lingering trace of yesterday's herbs from the communal oven. Perfume was not just expensive, it was intentionally exclusive. Rose oil, for instance, required an absurd quantity of petals. We're talking tens of thousands of roses for a single tiny vial. That meant land, labor, time, and infrastructure. The wealthy could afford to bathe in it. The poor, maybe they got to smell it once a year at a festival, if the wind was generous. That's your mainstream historical fact tonight. True adder concentrated natural perfume was a literal luxury. The production was so resource intensive that perfumers often lived under the protection of noble houses or religious institutions. They were treated like artists and sometimes like secrets, and their products were priced accordingly. A small bottle of true rose oil could cost more than a servant's annual wage. To smell like wealth, you had to own a piece of it. But it wasn't just about who could buy perfume, it was also about where you were allowed to wear it. In some cities, sumptuary laws restricted the use of certain scents to specific classes. Ambergris, reserved for royalty. Saffron, acceptable for merchants, but don't overdo it. Musk, if you weren't landed gentry, good luck wearing it in public without getting side-eyed. These weren't just guidelines, they were olfactory dress codes. Smell wrong, and you might be fined, or worse, publicly humiliated. It was a way to keep people in their place. A silent yet pungent enforcement of hierarchy. Die now. Let's swerve into your quirky tidbit for this moonlit stroll to fake wealth. Some lower-class citizens developed counterfeit scent blends, cheap herbs mixed with animal fat, strained through muslin, and stored in reused noble perfume bottles stolen or bought on the black market. These knockoff perfumes were known as ghost scents. Why? Because they were faint, unstable, and evaporated quickly, but for the first 5 minutes, you might pass for someone twice your station. Ghost scents became a minor scandal in larger cities. One satirical poem from the time mocks a suitor who wore the ghost of Oud and the sweat of deceit. You have to admit, it's kind of genius. The idea that scent could be aspirational wasn't new, but the lengths to which people went to fake it were staggering. Some even invented entire backstories for their perfume, claiming it was a gift from a traveling cousin or the result of a secret family blend. It's not unlike modern flexing with luxury brands, except instead of a logo, you had a smell. And if your story didn't hold up under scrutiny, well, let's just say people had very long noses for lies. There's another layer to this class scent dynamic: punishment. If you stepped out of line socially, politically, romantically, scent could be used to humiliate you. One known practice involved forcing someone to wear a scent deemed beneath them as public shame. For men, that often meant overly floral or feminine blends, worn loudly. For women, it might mean something pungent and medicinal, usually applied to the hem of their garments, where it would waft up throughout the day. Imagine being a noblewoman, forced to walk through the bazaar reeking of vinegar and crushed garlic while everyone pretends not to notice. The smell wasn't just unpleasant, it was a message. Historians still debate whether this scent-shaming practice was official policy. or more of a cultural punishment carried out informally, with nods and snickers and just enough plausible deniability to escape legal consequence. But the stories show up in both poetry and prose, often wrapped in metaphors, but unmistakably about perfume. One tale tells of a wealthy merchant's daughter who fell for a soldier. After the scandal broke, her family forced her to live among the servants, wearing the scent of burnt cumin and goat skin until she repented. Whether true or not, the moral was clear. Your scent told people where you belonged, and stepping out of that lane came with a price. But class wasn't just vertical, it was lateral, too. Within the elite, there were scent rivalries. Who had the rarest blend? Who had the most complex layer? Who had the newest import? This wasn't just friendly competition, it was war, fought nose first. One nobleman reportedly commissioned a perfumer to invent a scent no one else could imitate. It took 2 years and involved distilling oil from a flower that bloomed only once every 3 seasons, deep in the Zagros Mountains. The result? A perfume so unique that guests had to be escorted out of his home if they wore it elsewhere. The scent became, quite literally, the property of a single room. That's the kind of madness wealth makes possible. Let's return to the everyday folk for a moment. For those who couldn't afford perfume, scent still mattered. It just looked different. Instead of oils, they used smoke. Instead of vials, they used pouches of herbs. Some even sewed scent into their clothes, little sachets of lavender, dried citrus peel, or crushed juniper hidden in hems and cuffs. It wasn't luxury, but it was effort, a way of saying, I may not be rich, but I care how I move through the world. And that effort, that ingenuity, was sometimes more charming than any gilded bottle of imported jasmine. And yes, some of the poor were perfectly happy not to participate in the olfactory Olympics of the upper class. They mocked it, actually. Street performers often created parody perfumes using horrible smells, fish oil, old garlic, dried sweat from horse tack, and sold them as jokes. One infamous prank involved sneaking these blends into noble gatherings and watching the resulting chaos, because sometimes the only way to challenge class is to make a gag. As you round a corner and pass a series of shuttered homes, the air grows cleaner, lighter. Tainted with that faint eucalyptus sharpness of early morning, you realize something in this world. Said was the script everyone followed. Whether you were trying to rise above your station, protect your status, or call out the absurdity of the whole scented circus, your nose was never neutral. It sniffed out lies, desires, money, shame, and sometimes, if you were lucky, love, but only if you could afford it. The street beneath your feet begins to harden again, the loose scent giving way to smoother stone as you find yourself weaving between colonnades, at wind catchers where the breeze rolls down like a cyclone in a mountain spring. But there's a shift not just in the architecture, but in the air itself. You sniff instinctively, it's musk, faint but present, layered with mint and a whisper of cardamom. The scent is familiar and unfamiliar all at once, and then you realize why. This is seasonal perfume. You've wandered into the part of Persian life where fragrance doesn't just define status or seduction, it marks the passage of time itself. In ancient Persia, perfume changed with the seasons, like clothing, like mood, like music. And if you didn't change your scent, people might start to wonder what else about you was out of sync. You cast the trail of a winter blend now thick with labdanum, patchouli, and the sticky sweetness of dried figs. It hangs low in the air, like a blanket. This was the olfactory version of a wool coat. In colder months, people wore heavier scents, earthy, dense, comforting. Ingredients like myrrh, cedar, and benzoin were favored not just because they smelled good, but because they lingered on skin, on fabric, on the air. You didn't want a perfume that flitted away like a summer breeze. You wanted something that clung like a fire in the belly of the wind. And this wasn't just for personal preference. It was social expectation. Show up to a winter gathering smelling like spring florals, and someone would quietly ask if you were mourning. Wear summer oils in the autumn. People would assume you'd forgotten something important, or worse, lost touch with your senses. Scent, in this context, was about harmony with nature. Persians believed that aligning yourself with the season kept your spirit balanced, your health intact, and your luck somewhat cooperative. That's your mainstream historical insight. Seasonal fragrance in ancient Persia was not a trend, it was a therapeutic philosophy, deeply tied to the Zoroastrian worldview of balance between elements. Now, here's your fringe delight of the night. In some elite circles, scent calendars were kept in the home. These weren't for scheduling holidays or moon cycles, they were For scent transitions, the calendar would indicate when to retire certain oils and introduce others. One 12th century copy clearly made for the wealthy, and the painfully detailed recommended switching from rose and citrus to cinnamon and clove exactly 17 days after the autumn equinox. If you follow the plan, it claimed, you would smell as the world turns, which is both poetic and terrifyingly type-a-dot as you move past an open courtyard. A breeze carries in the smell of fresh basil, sharp, green, and entirely out of place. You pause. Someone's out of sync. A merchant, maybe, still clinging to summer out of nostalgia or stubbornness. But it reminds you, summer perfumes were a different beast. Light, acidic, playful. Ingredients like mint, rosewater, pomegranate flower, and sometimes even a drop of vinegar for that cooling effect. Yes, you heard that right. Vinegar was used in very low concentrations to create a sour note that lifted the rest of the scent and made the body feel less heavy in heat. It didn't mask sweat so much as pretend it had been invited. Speaking of sweat, let's be honest, Persian summers were hot. We're talking baked bread on a rock hot. So perfume wasn't just decorative, it was survival. Fragrances with antibacterial properties were favored to keep skin clean and clothes fresh. Men might apply a mix of lavender and mint to their underarms. Women, often restricted in movement, would perfume the insides of their sleeves, so when they fanned themselves, the scent would rise gently and create a cooling cloud. Some even perfumed their hairbrushes, so that each stroke released a subtle wave of scent over their shoulders. It wasn't a solution, but it helped out. Autumn and spring were the transitional seasons, and that meant layered scents. People would wear a light floral base, but add a single note of spice, or resin to reflect the shifting weather, a kind of olfactory sweater. These blends were often homemade crushed herbs from the garden, leftover oils from last season, sometimes mixed with beeswax or animal fat to form a paste that could be rubbed on wrists and neck. You imagine someone standing in their small kitchen courtyard, grinding basil into almond oil and whispering, "Maybe this will make him notice me," because yes, even in scent philosophy, there was room for yearning. Now let's touch on winter. Again, because winter was scent season royalty. This was when people flexed, when parties were held indoors, close together, heavy with spices, candle smoke, and warm skin. Perfume in winter had to cut through that atmosphere, so stronger ingredients came out: musk, amber, even civet. There's a story of a midwinter banquet where guests were so heavily perfumed that birds flying overhead dropped dead. That's obviously hyperbole, or is it? Either way, the point was clear. In the cold, you had to warm the air yourself. Here's your scholarly debate for the hour. Did these seasonal fragrance shifts come from religious customs, or were they developed by perfumers as a way to sell more product? Some argue that the Zoroastrian emphasis on purity and elemental balance naturally led to these seasonal cycles. Others say perfumers encouraged the changes as a business strategy. Rotate your oils, rotate your stock. The truth is probably both. Religion gave the structure, capitalism gave it flair. And now for the poorest among them, the people who couldn't afford rose oil or imported myrrh. They still participated in seasonal scent rituals, just in simpler ways. In spring, they'd gather local flowers and boil them into water for rinsing cloth. In summer, they'd soak linens in vinegar and lavender and hang them to dry over citrus peels. In winter, they burned onion skins and bay leaves to warm the air and scent the home in one go. It wasn't luxury, but it was rhythm. They marked time not with gold, but with the scent of what was available, and sometimes that was enough. As the night deepens and your footsteps echo gently down the long stone corridor of memory, you feel the season wrap around you, not just in temperature, but in smell. The air is turning cooler now. Somewhere nearby, someone's lighting a brazier filled with myrrh and cinnamon bark. Another home, another breath of winter. And as the scent curls toward you in the quiet, you understand what the Persians always knew. You don't need a calendar to know the season. You just need a nose. The road bends again, narrowing, the stones underfoot uneven now. Worn by time and weather and secrets too subtle for history books, the air grows still, almost cautious, like it knows where you're headed and isn't sure you're ready for it. Then the scent hits sweet, cloying, unnaturally strong. Not the gentle whisper of rose or the subtle pull of saffron, but something perfumed past politeness. You flinch instinctively. Someone's overdone it, but no, it's not by choice. Because tonight you're stepping into one of the strangest corners of Persian history, the punishment perfume. When scent wasn't just luxury or love, it was shame. Weaponized, public, inescapable. This is the part of the story where smelling good didn't mean status. It meant everyone knew exactly what you did wrong. You follow the scent to a public square, the kind once used for festivals and royal declarations, but also, sometimes, for public humiliations. In certain Persian cities during the later dynasties, when someone broke the social order, committed adultery, insulted a noble, misused temple property, or even just stepped far outside their role, they could be sentenced not with exile or lashes, but with scent. Specifically, being made to wear a perfume considered inappropriate or offensive to their gender, class, or station. The punishment was psychological, social, and deeply olfactory. Imagine a disgraced male clerk made to parade through the marketplace wearing a strong floral oil, something reserved for aristocratic women, drenched onto his robe so thickly that every step left behind a trail. The scent itself wasn't inherently bad. It was the message that he had been stripped of his dignity, that he now wore the perfume of someone he could never be. Children would point. Vendors would turn away. Friends might pretend not to know him, because scent wasn't just about how you smell. It was who you were in this case, who you no longer had the right to be. Here's your mainstream historical nugget. Persian court records from the Parthian and Sasanian periods reference olfactory punishments not always in direct terms, but in coded language about being clothed in scent not one's own, or walking with the air of stolen oil. The phrases appear in legal commentaries and even in satirical plays, suggesting it was not only real, but recognizable. These weren't isolated incidents. They were an accepted form of soft punishment, embarrassing, public, and critically temporary. The person wasn't permanently marked, but the memory of the smell would linger, and sometimes that was enough. Now your fringe delight for this evening. Some officials developed signature punishment blends. One particularly notorious governor in Media had a scent mix from syrupy fig extract, spoiled rosewater, and garlic oil. It was known informally as the donkey's apology. Offenders were doused in it and paraded during market hours. The blend was intentionally crafted to begin pleasant, but turned stomach-churningly sour. After about 15 minutes of body heat, people would gag as it ripened. No one forgot that smell, and that was the point. This wasn't just limited to men. Women, too, were subjected to scented humiliation, though more subtly. A woman caught flirting outside of marriage might be made to wear a bitter root oil, often used in funerary rites, for a week. It wasn't dangerous, but it was unmistakable. It told everyone, silently and pungently, that she had broken the code. Others would keep their distance, not from fear, but from association, to smell like death. When you were still alive was a kind of social exile. Now here's where it gets complicated. Not all punishment scents were offensive. Some were simply misaligned. A merchant who disrespected a judge might be made to wear a blend meant for royal women. A servant who tried to pass as a noble could be forced to wear the emperor's private blend, which, despite being objectively lovely, became a badge of ridicule because everyone knew it didn't belong on them. It was about displacement, scent as costume, and costume as confession. Historians still debate whether these punishments were formalized by law or handled informally through social codes and communal enforcement. Some cities likely had regulations, others merely traditions passed through gossip and ritual. But the consistency across regions and the way these practices show up in art and literature suggests they were well known, enough so that even the fear of being scented wrong could keep people in line. The nose, it turns out, was a very obedient enforcer. Let's talk about redemption, though, because even shame has a half-life. In some communities, a person could cleanse themselves literally and symbolically by undergoing a ritual washing with neutral or sacred oils. A common blend was made of olive oil, river water, and a touch of sandalwood. The offender would bathe, discard the punishment robes, and then re-enter society wearing an approved fragrance, usually something soft and unassuming like lavender or basil. It was a form of reacceptance. The community acknowledged the wrongdoing, but also the return. The scent was the cue. We're moving on. And not everyone submitted quietly. Some mocked the punishment by embracing it. There's one legendary account of a man condemned to wear a feminine perfume who, instead of being humiliated, leaned into the performance. He added bangles, walked with exaggerated elegance, and turned the whole ordeal into satire. Crowds followed him, not with jeers, but laughter. His sentence backfired. Within weeks, the governor who ordered it was mocked with the same sentan. The power shifted. That's the danger of scent. Once it's released, you can't control where it goes. There were also perfume protests. Lower-class citizens who felt unfairly taxed or mistreated would douse public statues in bitter, oils crude but unmistakable messages. The scent would cling for days, a ghost protest that couldn't be ignored. Cleaners could scrub the stone, but the smell lingered, a quiet rebellion carried on the breeze. You turn a corner now and catch a faint whiff of something oddly sour like jasmine. That stayed out too long in the sun. You don't see anyone, but the scent tells you someone passed through here recently. Someone's still wearing their pennants. It sticks to the wall like old gossip, and as you walk through it, you realize you're not just smelling their punishment. You're smelling their return, their resilience, maybe even their redemption, because as strange and twisted as these olfactory punishments were, they were still, in a way, merciful. No branding, no wounds, just scent and time, and the understanding that people can change, but that in Persia, change always had a smell. The wind changes again barely, subtle and nudging you into a quieter part of the city where the buildings huddle close, and balconies lean out like they're eavesdropping. You pass under a lattice window that sighs out a warm breeze laced with sandalwood and ink. There's something strange in the scent, something not floral, not herbal, but dry and deliberate. You pause. It's old parchment, perfumed parchment, and just like that, you've stepped into a forgotten classroom, or maybe a secret salon, because this part of the Persian scent journey isn't about gardens, or wedding, or punishment. It's about intellect. Tonight, we dive into how perfume met poetry, and how to smell literate in a world where ideas were as intoxicating as ambergris. Welcome to the scent of scholarship, where the pages were soaked and the poems weren't just read, they were worn. In the intellectual circles of ancient Persia, especially during the Sasanian era, and into the Islamic Golden Age, books and letters weren't always dry, dusty things. Many were perfumed, not overwhelmingly so, but intentionally. A scroll might be gently brushed with rosewater before being handed to a patron. A book of poetry might be sealed with a blend of violet and myrrh so that, when opened, it released a fragrance meant to mirror the emotion of the verses inside. It sounds decadent, but there was logic to it. Scent created memory, scent anchored meaning, and if a metaphor was too subtle to catch in the first read, the smell might help you recall it later, even if the word slipped away. That's your mainstream historical fact here. Persian scholars and calligraphers often scented their manuscripts, not just to impress, but as an early form of aesthetic literacy. If you understood that a poem about longing was supposed to smell like saffron and smoke, you were operating on a different level than someone who only saw the ink. You weren't just reading. You were decoding, participating, feeling. The calligraphers, too, were part perfumers. Some inks were infused with scents using distilled herbs or floral waters in place of plain water. It added texture, sure, but also prestige. Imagine receiving a letter from a philosopher that smelled faintly of clove and thyme. You wouldn't just read it, you'd breathe it, and you'd remember the scent every time you thought about the argument inside. It was sent as a mnemonic device. You didn't memorize. You scented your way through. Now your fringe fact. There are notes in the margins of some surviving manuscripts, mostly poetry collections and philosophical treatises, that describe intended scent pairings. These weren't instructions, exactly, but suggestions. Best read in the presence of fig leaf smoke, or blend of basil and ash recommended. Were these real scent guides, or poetic flourishes? Historians still argue, but enough of them appear in texts from multiple centuries to suggest this wasn't a one-off trend. Some readers likely scented their rooms before reading. Others probably dabbed perfume on the edge of the page before lending the book to someone. They wanted to impress, and impress they did. Among the elite, knowledge wasn't just about what you knew, it was how you carried it. A scholar who smelled right was considered more refined, more trustworthy. There's a delightful line from a court diary that reads, "He speaks like cedar smoke and smells like resolution." It's absurd, it's perfect, and it tells you everything. In a time when philosophy was shared orally and in writing, to smell appropriately for the topic was a kind of intellectual costume. Debating ethics, go with amber and myrrh. Writing love poetry, obviously rose and cinnamon. Hosting a recitation of mystical verse. Burn a little spikenard in the corner and let your audience drift into a dream state. The set wasn't separate from the content. It was part of the atmosphere of learning. Let's not forget the students. Not everyone in the room was a seasoned poet or wealthy scribe. Many were young apprentices learning the art of calligraphy, translation, logic. and scent all at once. In some schools, instructors required students to scent their writing paper as a final flourish, not to be indulgent, but to remind them words aren't sterile. They have shape, sound, smell. They enter through the eyes but live in the breath. If your page stank of sweat or grease, it wasn't just messy. It was considered disrespectful to the ideas themselves. And yes, love found its way into this, too. Because what's a poem without a reader, and what's a reader without a heartbeat? There are recorded cases, usually in whispered court gossip, of lovers exchanging books, not with inscriptions, but with scent cues. A manuscript of mystical verse, delivered in person, sealed with orange blossom. A scroll of bitter philosophical argument, sent by a jilted suitor, soaked in basil and lemon oil. A woman known only by the nickname Saffron Fingers once sent a collection of translated medical texts to her favorite physician, each chapter scented differently. She included no note, no signature, but the final chapter smelled unmistakably of frankincense and desire. The physician married her a year later. Coincidence? Not likely. Here's your open debate. Were scented books and writings a widespread practice or an elite eccentricity? Some scholars argue that only the wealthy could afford the oils, the scented inks, the time. Others suggest that scenting pages was a cultural norm, especially in the courts and temples. Regardless, the surviving evidence points to a culture that believed deeply in multisensory learning, and the more you dig, the clearer it becomes ancient. Persian thinkers didn't separate intellect from emotion or ideas from embodiment. They understood that to teach someone something, you had to reach all of them, and that included the nose dot as you walked through what must have once been a scholar's quarter. Your feet whisper over broken tiles painted with verses, your fingers grazing the edge of a crumbling alcove. The air here is softer than before, not floral, not smoky, just faintly herbal, like dried lavender crumbled between old pages. You pause, close your eyes, and for a moment you swear you can hear the scratch of a reed pen, the warm breath of a student repeating lines aloud, the sudden hush when a teacher lights a small coal of incense and sets it near the window to perfume the room before beginning a story. That's what you're walking through now, not a ruin, but a memory made of ink and oil and the relentless, romantic belief that knowledge should linger long after the sound has faded. Your path tilts slightly uphill now, the stones rougher underfoot, the wind thinner and sharper, carrying with it the unmistakable sting of cold metal and burnt sage. It's less romantic here, less ceremonial. The scents have changed. There, not sweet, not soft, not even trying to impress, and then you realize why. You're walking into a part of history that doesn't show up in perfume bottles or poetry scrolls. This is scent born of damage, of improvisation. You're entering the world of olfactory workaround when perfume became prosthetic. This is the story of the nobleman who lost his nose, and how that one injury turned him, and those like him, into pioneers of scent communication that reshaped Persian courtship in strange and brilliant ways. You pass a crumbling archway where the walls once bore painted scenes of court processions, now faded outlines of cloaks and falcons, and faint trails of incense. But in the corner, something more curious catches your attention, a carved nose, or rather, a lack of one, a face, with a smooth space where the nose should be. It's not vandalism, it's a tribute. You've just stumbled across the legend of Marin the Fragrant, a noble who, according to several accounts, lost his nose in a duel, then went on to redefine how scent was used in the empire's most intimate spaces. The story goes like this. Marin, a high-born courtier in the Sasanian capital, was known for his keen sense of smell. He could identify a perfume's ingredients with a single breath. He helped the royal perfumer craft the king's personal scent. He even settled disputes over dowry oils. But during a duel over love, naturally he took a blade to the face. The damage was clean, clinical, and devastating. No nose, no sense of smell, and by court standards, no value. In Persian culture, where scent was synonymous with status, identity, and seduction, losing your nose was more than disfigurement. It was a social death. Marin was mocked, exiled from polite gatherings, even stripped of perfume privileges because what use was sent to someone who couldn't perceive it. But that's where things get interesting, because Marin didn't retreat. He reinvented. Your mainstream fact for tonight: prosthetics and scent aids were a part of ancient Persian medical practice. Doctors created hollow metal noses, some gold, some silver, for those who lost the real thing to injury or illness. These prosthetics weren't just for appearance, they were functional. Some had small vents lined with cloth soaked in scent. Marin took that idea and turned it into art, instead of trying to mimic his lost sense. He began using his scent prosthetic as communication, one blend for joy, one for sorrow, one for political neutrality. He commissioned custom oils, even trained his attendants to apply different blends for different audiences. It became his signature. You didn't read his face, you read the air around him. If he approached smelling of clove and cypress, it meant he was in favor. If he wore only sandalwood, it was a warning. No scent. That meant contempt. It was silent. Diplomacy, and it caught on. Now for your delightfully odd fringe detail. Marin reportedly threw a party once, where guests were given scent charts instead of seating maps. Each chair had a different perfume applied, and guests had to match their mood to a seat. One scroll describes it as a garden of feelings made visible only to the nose. Absurd? Absolutely, but unforgettable. His influence grew. Others mimicked the method. Suddenly, having no sense of smell wasn't weakness, it was mythos. People began assigning scent meanings even outside court. A lavender handshake, a murdered apology, a farewell wrapped in basil and smoke. This movement didn't stop with Marin. Other injured courtiers, some from war, others from disease, began adopting scented prosthetics or scent halos. These were aromatic tools worn around the neck or head, designed to signal intention without needing words or facial expression. Some were simple sachets. Others were elaborate contraptions that released fragrance with the pull of a chain or the flick of a wrist. Imagine a fan that, when opened, wafted a specific blend across a room. No words spoken, just a message sent in smoke. Here's where the historians argue. Some claim this olfactory signaling system was short-lived, a trend confined to a few eccentric circles. Others argue it laid the groundwork for a more symbolic use of scent in Persian courtship and diplomacy for centuries to come. What's clear is that, in the wake of Marin's accident, people began to take scent not only as an enhancement, but as an alternative to language, especially for those who've lost the traditional tools of expression, sight, voice, or in this case, smell. Not all of these innovations were highbrow. Some trickled into the marketplace, where sellers adopted scent signals for pricing or quality. Others appeared in personal courtship rituals. A shy lover might deliver a scented cloth to a beloved not just for fragrance, but as a code, mint for patience, cinnamon for courage, rose for devotion. In homes, elderly or sick family members who could no longer speak clearly were sometimes given scented bowls or oils they could hold to indicate mood. A bowl of crushed juniper, contentment. One of marigold and vinegar, disgust. It was crude, but it was a start. Even in poetry, the idea of scent as speech took hold. Lines like his silence smelled of myrrh, or she answered with basil, instead of breath, appear more frequently after this period. Scent became metaphor for intention, not just emotion, but action. To wear a scent was to say something. To refuse a scent was to contradict it. Marin's legacy, though accidental, turned perfume from accessory into vocabulary. Your feet finally carry you to a quiet overlook, the wind brushing gently against your cheek, and you can almost smell one of those rare prosthetic blends: leather, pine resin, and a strange citrus note that doesn't quite belong. You wonder what message it meant to send. Perhaps resolve, perhaps defiance, or maybe just memory. The idea that scent, when words fail or faces break, still carries meaning. Because in the end, what Marin taught his world was this: losing your nose doesn't mean losing your voice. And sometimes, the air you carry says more than your mouth ever could. The wind shifts again, this time with purpose. It's stronger now, whipping around corners, stirring up dust that smells faintly of iron and wild rose. You squint against the breeze and sense it immediately, something bigger than a personal story, heavier than a lover's sigh. You're not in someone's garden anymore. You've stepped onto the edge of empire, and the scent, it's more than memory, it's political. Because tonight, you're walking into one of the strangest battlefronts in Persian history, where armies clashed not just for territory or power, but for the control of a scent. This is the tale of how empires fought over flower water. Now, that might sound ridiculous at first. You've heard of wars over gold, over oil, over borders. But rosewater? Surely not. And yet, here you are, standing on the wine-swept hills near the ancient city of Nishapur, where once caravans creaked under the weight of clay jugs filled not with wine or grain, but with gallons of distilled rose essence, and they were guarded like treasure, because they were treasure. In fact, some treaties scribbled in flowery script between Persia and Rome included clauses about fragrance trade routes. Not silk, not salt, scent. That's your mainstream historical fact. The demand for Persian rosewater, myrrh, and attar became so politically charged that controlling their distribution turned into a soft pow. Our chess game between competing empires. You walk past a crumbled board or stone, half buried in dried herbs, and catch a sudden whiff of rose. Not the sweet, overdone rose of modern perfume counters, but something sharper, more resinous, what rosewater really smells like when it hasn't been diluted to nothing. This was currency. Persian rosewater, especially that from Kashan and Shiraz, was considered the gold standard. Its purity, its shelf life, its ability to hold emotion. As one poetic merchant put it, made it the prize of the perfume world. And whoever controlled the rose harvest controlled more than agriculture, they controlled diplomacy. Here's your French tidbit. During one of the many Roman-Persian standoffs, a Roman general reportedly requested a cask of Persian rosewater, not as a peace offering, but as proof that the Persians still considered Rome civilized enough to deserve it. The Persians refused. They sent frankincense instead, a scent associated with mourning. It was a passive-aggressive olfactory insult, and the battle resumed within days. Scent as subtext. Scent as subtle warfare. Control over these aromatic goods also meant influence over ritual. Rosewater wasn't just splashed on bedsheets and lovers' hair. It was used in coronations, religious ceremonies, funeral rites, and medical treatments. Persian physicians prescribed it for everything from melancholy to migraines. Priests used it to purify altars. Brides walked through mist of it before approaching their new homes. So if another empire wanted to borrow that prestige, that legitimacy, they needed the real thing, and the only place to get it, at least in its finest form, was Persia. This led to one of the oddest economic movements of the time, scent espionage. Merchants from neighboring kingdoms, especially in the Byzantine and later Islamic periods, tried to smuggle rose cuttings and distillation techniques out of Persia. Some succeeded, others were caught and punished not with death, but with forced labor in rose fields, forbidden from ever producing scent for profit again. The message was clear: you don't steal our soul and try to bottle it yourself. Let's not forget the infrastructure behind all this. Rosewater required roses, obviously, but also fresh water, stills, fuel, glass or clay containers, and transportation that kept the product from spoiling in desert heat. Entire towns were built around this economy. Harvesters worked from before dawn until midday, collecting petals by hand, storing them in linen sacks. Perfumers oversaw boiling vats, controlling temperature with terrifying precision, and caravan leaders organized routes designed to keep the cargo cool and safe. It wasn't just trade, it was a religion. And the smells that marked these efforts weren't always pleasant. A rose field smells glorious at sunrise, but the distillation room, acrid, smoky, thick with steam. Some workers wore scarves over their noses, not to protect themselves from chemicals they didn't have those, but to keep from becoming nose blind. Because losing the ability to distinguish scents meant losing money, status, and sometimes even your job. The nose was the tool, the business, the battlefield. Now here's your open debate. Did these scent-driven conflicts ever truly escalate into full-scale wars, or were they just another lever in larger struggles over trade and territory? Some historians argue that perfume trade was always secondary, an add-on to the more serious resources. Others suggest that when everything else was evenly matched, troops, silver, wheat, the empire with better rosewater held the psychological edge. After all, a leader who smells like heaven carries a different weight than one who smells like sweat and fear. There are records of captured nobles being gifted scent blends as both mockery and mercy. A defeated general might receive a bottle of rare attar not as a reward, but as a reminder of what he could no longer afford. On the other hand, alliances were sometimes sealed with the gift of scent. One tale tells of a Persian princess betrothed to a foreign king who refused to bring a dowry, only her personal perfume chest. Inside were 12 flasks, each representing a different phase of life: youth, desire, grief, wisdom, betrayal, and so on. She claimed that no gold could teach her husband more than her scent. And then there were the scent forgeries. Other regions tried to copy Persian formulas, some well, most poorly, but the elite noses could tell. A too sweet rose, a musk that faded in sunlight, a bottle sealed with wax that cracked in heat. Merchants who sold fake Persian perfume could be banned from markets or, worse, paraded through towns wearing their own bad product. There's a poem from the era that reads, "He who sells a lie in amber shall stink of it for a week." Rough justice, but memorable. You're walking now beside the remnants of an old scent market, a stone foundation, where clay stills might have bubbled and goats once loitered. The breeze carries a trace of geranium, maybe just wild brush now. But you imagine what it was. An air thick with diplomacy, ambition, and the heady belief that if you could bottle perfection, you could control the world. And for a little while, Persia did, not just with swords or scripts, but with scent. The sky is velvet now, deep, soundless, pierced only by stars that blink like old oil lamps in a forgotten room. You walk slower. The scents are thinner now, less aggressive, as if even they are bowing out for the night. The last breezes carry lavender and ash, the faintest hint of myrrh, and something else, something final. You've wandered beyond the temples, the gardens, the courts. You're standing in a necropolis, the city of the silent. This is where the perfumes change once more, not to attract, not to impress, not even to shame, but to mourn and to remember. Because even in death, the ancient Persians sent their goodbyes. The funerary practices of Persia weren't uniform. They shifted across centuries and sects, particularly between Zoroastrianism, which preferred sky burial and exposure to the elements, and later Islamic practices which emphasized burial and anointment. But they shared something critical. Scent was always present. A corpse was not just laid to rest, it was wrapped, washed, anointed, and surrounded by specific smells designed not only to purify, but to comfort. You pause beside a stone slab where once bodies were laid under moonlight. The scent of saffron rises from the windless earth, as if someone, somewhere, spilled a memory here 1,000 years ago and forgot to clean it up. That's your mainstream, historical moment. Ancient Persians believed scent could accompany the soul. It wasn't just a ritual flourish, it was a necessity. The idea was that pleasant smells made the spirit's journey smoother and kept malevolent forces at bay during its transition. Funerary oils, usually a mix of frankincense, myrrh, and sometimes bay palm resin, were applied to the body's joints, chest, and forehead, not to preserve, but to dignify, to tell the soul and everyone present, you were loved. You are not going foul into the silence, and yet, not all scents were equal in this final chapter. Only certain oils were deemed appropriate for death. Wearing perfume associated with seduction or luxury was taboo. Imagine someone passing away and being anointed in a lover's blend. It would have been scandalous. Instead, funerary blends leaned on austerity, bitter herbs, dried woods, florals that faded quickly. The goal wasn't to mask decay. It was to guide the spirit gently away from the body and into wherever it was meant to go. A scent trail to the next world. Neither fringe to tail. In some villages, especially in mountainous or desert areas, mourners wore scent in solidarity with the dead. Not strong perfume, but a single drop of the same oil used in the ceremony, usually on the inside of the wrist or behind the ear. It was a way to keep the memory physically close. For days after the funeral, if someone wept or embraced a mourner, they'd catch that whiff of frankincense or vetiver and know, yes, he's still being remembered. Some widows wore the scent for weeks, even months, and when it finally faded, it marked the moment when remembrance turned from ritual to memory. Let's pause with a question scholars still argue over. Were these funerary scents really for the dead or for the living? Some religious texts say the scent calmed the soul. Others suggest it comforted the mourners. The smell of continuity, a reminder that life continues and that grief, while messy, can also be fragrant, a little theatrical, sure, but in a culture where scent did so much work in life, it makes sense that it carried one final burden: to help people say goodbye. There are even records of tombs sealed with scented wax. Not incense, not oils, but hardened blends of herbs and resin melted over the burial chamber like a signature. Some of these have been found intact, broken open centuries later, still releasing a whisper of their original note. Imagine standing in a room that's been sealed for 2,000 years and smelling something someone prepared for a person they never wanted to forget. It's not haunting, it's intimate, the closest thing to time travel the nose can manage. But the scent of death wasn't only about solemnity. In some elite circles, it became art. Wealthy families commissioned custom funeral perfumes, blends designed to reflect the personality of the deceased. A scholar might be sent off with cedar, ink oil, and crushed bay leaves, a dancer, cinnamon, rose, and musk. There's even a case where a noblewoman's tomb was found with a sealed amphora labeled laughters. Memory, no ingredients listed, just the name. The amphora, when open, smelled like citrus, old sandalwood, and something fruity, fig, Maybe. Whether it was her favorite scent, or just how her family remembered her, we'll never know. But the perfume outlived her bones. Even more poetic, in some communities, people will leave scent offerings at graves. Not flowers, not coins, but drops of perfume on the ground, a ritual known as sending the silence. It wasn't about keeping up appearances. It was about marking time. You came. You remembered. You released something fragrant into the earth. There's a saying from that era. No one is gone if their name and scent still linger, which may explain why poets sometimes requested to be buried with their ink and their oil, so that even their dust could whisper. And let's not ignore the emotional side, because loss doesn't just hurt the heart. It haunts the senses. Many mourners reported phantom scents after death, the sudden whiff of a husband's clove beard oil, the memory of a child's lavender bathwater, a grandmother's mint basil tea blend wafting in from nowhere. Today we might call that imagination or grief's hallucination. Back then, it was accepted as visitations, proof that love doesn't vanish. It just changes format. As you stand now on the edge of the graveyard, the scent has shifted again. Drier, older, like dust infused with memories it refuses to release. You think of all the lives sealed with oil and ash, all the lovers who scented their goodbye letters, all the families who chose one final blend and prayed it would carry across whatever invisible barrier separated breath from eternity, because in Persia, love didn't end with death. It lingered in recipes, in rituals, in the way a certain smell could make a person cry a decade after the funeral. And maybe that's the most powerful fragrance of all, the one that hurts a little, but keeps us close. And now, as your footsteps soften on the gravel path that winds between silent tombs and empty breeze block homes, you feel the air ease. The scents have changed again, barely there now. Like ghosts that know you've seen enough for one night. You're not in a bazaar, or a palace, or a battlefield anymore. You're standing at the end, not of the road, exactly, but of the story, or at least this chapter of it. Because what you've been breathing in all night isn't just rosewater and musk. It's a civilization's soul, and as the final thread of amber smoke unwinds above your head, we come to the quietest question of all. What did it all mean? You stop walking. There's nothing ahead now but dark hills and the slow, rhythmic rustle of the wind playing through dry leaves. Somewhere behind you, a dog barks once and falls silent again, and in that hush, you let the memories catch up. The first scent that greeted you tonight, warm, spiced, flirtatious at a festival where lovers traded oils like vows, the sandalwood stained, scarlet scroll where perfume was punctuation, the field general's lost treaty, broken by a denied shipment of rosewater, the ghost of Marin wearing power not in his body, but in the air around him, the woman whose tomb still smelled, like a smile, all of them still here, still lingering. That's the strange thing about scent. It doesn't really die. It just moves, clings, waits. And if tonight has taught you anything, it's that ancient Persian knew that long before anyone else did, they didn't just use perfume to smell good. They used it to communicate, to remember, to rebel, to mourn. Scent was more than luxury, it was language, and like all languages, it had dialects, the sweet cinnamon of seduction, the vinegary bite of defiance, the eucalyptus chill of clarity. It was a code. If you knew how to read it, you knew everything. You might be wondering what happened to those recipes, the real ones, the blends that made queens swoon and soldiers pause mid-swing to inhale. Some were written down fragments, mostly in cookbooks and medical scrolls. Others were carried orally, passed from perfumer to apprentice in backrooms, lit with flame and floating dust. And some lost entirely, or maybe not. Maybe they're waiting locked in the back of some neglected archive, or buried beneath a ruin, or still hanging in the air above a garden that no one visits anymore, but that the wind refuses to forget. That's your final scholarly puzzle. Can we ever really know what these people smelled? Historians debate it endlessly. We can guess, reconstruct, synthesize, but scent, unlike sculpture or pottery or ink, leaves no fossil. It's ephemeral, and yet, somehow, more emotionally real than anything you can touch. So maybe it doesn't matter whether our modern versions are accurate. Maybe what matters is that we're still trying, still breathing it in, still letting it teach us dot. And in case you missed it, here's your fringe finish. Some modern perfumers in Iran and beyond are trying to revive these lost scents, using old recipes, regional herbs, and a dash of educated guesswork. They're crafting perfumes they believe would have passed inspection in the courts of Darius or the chambers of Shirin, One even claims he reconstructed the smell of first love, according to Avicenna. Whether that's marketing or magic, who knows? But the ambition, the yearning, that's pure Persia. So here you are, eyes heavy, limbs slow, thoughts a little soft around the edges. That's okay. You've walked far tonight. Through markets and bedrooms, through betrayal and bliss, through gardens grown for kisses and corridors designed for poison. You've smelled the empire from birth to death, and all the messy, fragrant days in between. And if you've been paying attention, really breathing it in, then you already know the story never ends. Because someone, somewhere, is always mixing anew oil, always setting fire to a little pile of herbs, always passing a letter that smells like something you can't name, but will never forget. Maybe tomorrow, when you wake, a whiff of basil or old cedar will catch you off guard, and maybe, just maybe, it'll take you back here, to this road, this night, this quiet inhale at the edge of history. So now, as the final scents of the evening fade into memory, let your breath slow. In through the nose, deep and easy, hold out through the mouth, soft and steady, again. Slower this time, inhale the quiet, exhale the weight. You've wandered far tonight, not just through cities and scrolls, but through the invisible world of the Persian past, where love and power and sorrow were all wrapped in scent. You've met courtiers who wore their secrets, healers who dabbed hope onto the skin, widows who mourned with oil on their wrists. You've learned that history doesn't only speak in battles or borders. It speaks in spices, in petals, in perfume. Now, picture the last garden you passed, just on the edge of the desert. Imagine it as sunrise, empty of people, but full of promise. A breeze moves across the roses, lifting their scent like a prayer. It brushes past your face, familiar, and then vanishes, as if it's delivered its message and has somewhere else to be. You sit, you wait, you rest, because this story is finished, and your breath is enough now. Let the silence hold you, let the dark wrap you up, not with fear, but with the gentleness of someone tucking in a favorite story. The scent is gone now, but the memory lingers, and maybe that's all scent ever wanted to be. A quiet way of saying remember me. End of script. Sweet dreams.